Hello everyone, welcome to my channel, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. Octavia and Oscar Fairweather's love story began like a fairy tale. They met as undergraduates at Creekside College, where Octavia studied art and Oscar pursued a degree in business administration. Octavia captivated Oscar from the moment he saw her by the campus lake. Oscar, tall and charismatic with a disarming smile, wooed Octavia with his charm and ambition. They married shortly after graduation with dreams of building a life together in their hometown. Octavia secured a position as an art teacher at high school, where her passion for creativity and nurturing young talent quickly made her a favorite among students and faculty alike. Oscar, leveraging his family connections, landed a job at a prestigious local investment firm, climbing the corporate ladder with remarkable speed. As the years passed, the Fairweathers became pillars of the Creekside community. They were fixtures at galas and town council meetings. Their home in Oakwood Estates, purchased with Oscar's growing wealth, became a symbol of their success. Octavia's artistic touch was evident in every room, from the hand-painted murals in the living room to the carefully curated sculptures in their backyard. To the outside world, Octavia and Oscar were the epitome of a power couple. They complemented each other perfectly. Octavia's creativity balancing Oscar's business acumen, her warmth softening his sometimes brusque demeanor. Friends often remarked on how they still looked at each other with the same adoration they had in college. Yet beneath the surface of this picture-perfect life, there were undercurrents of tension. Octavia and Oscar had been trying to conceive for years without success. The strain of fertility treatments and dashed hopes began to wear on their relationship. Oscar threw himself into his work, spending long hours at the office while Octavia found solace in her art and her students. It was during this challenging time that Octavia's relationship with her mother, Cordelia Prescott, became a source of comfort and support. Cordelia, a widow who lived on the outskirts of town, had always been a free spirit. In her youth, she had traveled the world as a photojournalist, settling down in Creekside only after meeting Octavia's father. After his passing, Cordelia had retreated into a quieter life, focusing on her garden and her volunteer work at the local animal shelter. As Octavia spent more time with her mother, Oscar found himself drawn into Cordelia's orbit as well. What began as polite conversation during family dinners slowly evolved into something more, setting the stage for a betrayal that would tear the Fairweather family apart. The seeds of the affair between Oscar and Cordelia were planted on a crisp autumn evening. Octavia, consumed with preparing for an upcoming art exhibition featuring her students' work, Oscar, feeling neglected and frustrated by the growing distance in his marriage, decided to go to Cordelia's cottage alone, ostensibly to check on his mother-in-law. Cordelia, surprised but pleased by the unexpected visit, welcomed Oscar with a warm smile and a glass of her homemade wine. As they sat in her small, cluttered living room, surrounded by eclectic souvenirs from her travels, Oscar found himself opening up about his marital troubles. Cordelia listened with empathy, her eyes, so similar to Octavia's, filled with understanding. Perhaps it was the wine, or the intimate atmosphere, or simply the need for human connection. But that night, a line was crossed. A comforting touch lingered too long. A gaze held more meaning than it should have. By the time Oscar left Cordelia's cottage, both knew that something had irrevocably changed. In the weeks that followed, Oscar and Cordelia manufactured reasons to see each other. Cordelia suddenly needed help with home repairs, while Oscar discovered a newfound interest in gardening. Their clandestine meetings became more frequent, always carefully timed to avoid suspicion. During one of their early encounters, Oscar arrived at Cordelia's cottage to help fix a leaky faucet. As they worked side by side in the cramped space of her bathroom, the air between them grew thick with unspoken tension. Their hands brushed accidentally, sending electric shocks through both of them when Cordelia reached past Oscar for a towel. He caught the scent of her perfume, a heady mix of jasmine and vanilla that made his head swim. Their eyes met in the mirror, and for a moment neither could look away. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Cordelia was showing Oscar how to prune her rose bushes as she demonstrated the technique, standing close behind him to guide his hands. Both were acutely aware of their physical proximity. The gentle brush of her breath on his neck, the warmth of her body against his back, sent shivers down Oscar's spine. When he turned to ask a question, their faces were inches apart. Time seemed to stand still as they stood there, frozen in a moment of forbidden desire. During a rare moment alone at a family gathering, Oscar and Cordelia stole away to the secluded garden behind the house. Hidden from view by a trellis covered in climbing roses, they gave in to their desires. Their kisses were urgent, hands roaming with a desperation born of stolen moments. As they heard Octavia's voice calling for them, they quickly separated, straightening their clothes and hair. The guilt was immediate, but so was the thrill of their secret affair, adding a dangerous excitement to their illicit encounters. Their affair consumed them, blinding them to the consequences of their actions. In Cordelia's bedroom, a space once reserved for solitary nights, they now created a world of secret passion. The creak of bed springs and hushed whispers became a symphony of their illicit love, playing out against the backdrop of familial betrayal. As their physical intimacy deepened, so too did their emotional entanglement. What had started as a physical attraction morphed into something more complex and dangerous. They began to imagine a future together, heedless of the devastation such dreams would wreak on their family. It was this combination of physical passion and emotional connection that would ultimately lead to their undoing. They justified their actions in whispered conversations. Oscar spoke of feeling unappreciated and misunderstood by Octavia, while Cordelia confessed to a loneliness that had plagued her since her husband's death. They convinced themselves that their connection was special, something that transcended the boundaries of the conventional. As the affair deepened, so did their web of lies. Oscar began to invent business trips and late meetings. Cordelia feigned illness to avoid family gatherings. They communicated through a secret email account and disposable phones, always careful to cover their tracks, but with each deception, the weight of guilt grew heavier. Oscar found it increasingly difficult to look Octavia in the eye, while Cordelia's interactions with her daughter became strained and awkward. The very relationship that had once been Octavia's source of comfort was now tainted by betrayal. Neither Oscar nor Cordelia could have foreseen the devastating consequences their actions would have on the entire Fairweather family as they continued their illicit liaison. They remained oblivious to the suspicions beginning to form in Octavia's mind. The first inkling that something was amiss came to Octavia on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She had decided to surprise Oscar with lunch at his office, only to be told by his confused secretary that he had left early, mentioning a meeting with a client. Octavia brushed it off as a miscommunication, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Over the following weeks, Octavia began to notice subtle changes in Oscar's behavior. He was more distracted, often lost in thought during their conversations. His phone would buzz at odd hours, and he would step out of the room to take calls in hushed tones. When questioned, Oscar would dismiss her concerns with vague explanations about work stress and important deals in the pipeline. Octavia's artistic sensitivity, usually a source of joy in her life, now became a curse as she picked up on minute details that others might have missed. The faint scent of unfamiliar perfume on Oscar's clothes, a lipstick smudge on a coffee mug he brought home from the office the way he sometimes avoided her touch. All these observations accumulated in her mind, forming a picture she didn't want to see. Her relationship with her mother also began to change. Cordelia, once eager to spend time with her daughter, now seemed distant and preoccupied. Their weekly tea sessions became less frequent, with Cordelia often canceling at the last minute, citing various commitments when they did meet. Octavia sensed a nervousness in her mother's demeanor, a reluctance to meet her eyes that was entirely out of character. As her suspicions grew, Octavia found herself trapped in a spiral of doubt and self-recrimination. She questioned every interaction, analyzed every word spoken by Oscar and Cordelia. Was she imagining things? Had the stress of their fertility struggles in her upcoming exhibition made her paranoid? Determined to find the truth, Octavia began to investigate discreetly. She checked Oscar's credit card statements, noting several charges at restaurants and hotels that he had never mentioned. She drove by her mother's cottage at odd hours, her heart sinking when she spotted Oscar's car parked down the street on an evening when he was supposedly working late. Each new piece of evidence felt like a physical blow, chipping away at the foundation of trust that had been the bedrock of her life. Octavia's students and colleagues noticed the change in her demeanor, the dark circles under her eyes, the tremor in her hands as she demonstrated brush techniques, the forced smile that never quite reached her eyes. As the days passed, Octavia became a shadow of her former self, torn between confronting her fears and clinging to the last shreds of hope that she was mistaken. Little did she know that the truth, when it finally came to light, would be even more devastating than she could have imagined. The day Octavia's world shattered began like any other. It was a Saturday, and she had spent the morning at the school. Putting the finishing touches on the student art exhibition, Oscar had left early, mumbling something about a golf game with clients. As Octavia drove home, her mind preoccupied with last-minute details for the upcoming show, she decided on a whim to stop by her mother's cottage. Perhaps a cup of tea and a chat would help calm her nerves. As Octavia turned onto the quiet lane leading to Cordelia's home, her heart nearly stopped. There, parked behind, was Oscar's sleek black sedan for a moment. Octavia sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel. She told herself there could be an innocent explanation, but deep down she knew. With trembling legs, Octavia approached the cottage. The curtains were drawn, but through a gap she could see movement inside. Taking a deep breath, she used her key to unlock the door, pushing it open as quietly as possible. The sight that greeted her would be forever seared into her memory. There, on the floral-patterned couch, they were locked in an intimate embrace. Oblivious to the world around them, Cordelia's hair was disheveled. Shirt partially unbuttoned on the coffee table, two half-empty wine glasses stood as mute witnesses to their betrayal. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, as if sensing her presence, Oscar and Cordelia looked up, the expressions on their faces, shock, guilt, and a flicker of defiance. What followed was a blur of emotions and accusations. Octavia's anguished cry broke the silence, startling the guilty pair. Oscar jumped to his feet, stammering excuses and pleas. Cordelia remained seated, her face ashen, tears streaming down her cheeks. Octavia, her voice raw with pain and fury, hurled questions at them. The answers, when they came, were like daggers to her heart. 6 months. It started as friendship, then evolved. They hadn't meant for it to happen. They were sorry. Unable to bear their presence any longer, Octavia fled the cottage. She drove aimlessly for hours, her mind replaying the scene over and over. By the time she returned home, the sun had set. Casting long shadows across the manicured lawn of the house, she had once considered her sanctuary as she sat in the darkened living room. Surrounded by the trappings of her seemingly perfect life, Octavia felt something inside her break. The pain, the betrayal, the sheer magnitude of the deception. In that moment, a cold resolve began to form in her heart. Someone would have to pay for this betrayal, and Octavia knew exactly who that someone would be. The events leading up to the fatal shooting unfolded over several tense hours on that warm summer evening. Octavia, having spent the day in a haze of grief and anger, found herself pacing the halls of her home like a caged animal. The tick of the clock in the foyer seemed to mock her, counting down the moments until her world would irrevocably change. As dusk fell, Oscar returned home. He entered cautiously, his usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. Octavia watched from the shadows of the dining room as he hung up his jacket and loosened his tie, the familiar routine now tainted by the knowledge of his betrayal. Oscar called out Octavia's name, his voice strained with apprehension. When she stepped into the light, he visibly flinched. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the vibrant, loving wife he had known. Octavia's eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, her posture rigid with barely contained fury. Oscar, his face a mask of guilt and desperation, launched into a litany of excuses and apologies. He spoke of feeling neglected, of the pressures of work and their fertility struggles. He claimed the affair had been a mistake, a moment of weakness that had spiraled out of control. With each word, Octavia felt her anger rising, a tide of rage threatening to overwhelm her. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Octavia found herself walking to Oscar's study. She knew he kept a handgun in the desk drawer, a precaution he had insisted on after a series of break insurance in the neighborhood. As if in a trance, she retrieved the weapon, feeling its cold weight in her hand. When she returned to the living room, Oscar's eyes widened in shock and fear. He raised his hands, backing away slowly, his words now coming in a panicked rush. He promised to end the affair, to go to counseling, to do whatever it took to save their marriage. But Octavia barely heard him. In her mind, she saw only images of Oscar and Cordelia together, their betrayal playing on an endless loop. What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. Oscar lunged forward, perhaps trying to disarm her. In that moment of chaos and heightened emotion, Octavia's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confines of the room, followed by an eerie silence, broken only by the tinkling of shattered glass from a fallen picture frame. Oscar staggered backward, a look of disbelief on his face as he pressed his hand to his chest. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining his crisp white shirt crimson. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. His eyes locked on Octavia's in a silent plea. As the reality of what she had done crashed over her, Octavia dropped the gun. It clattered to the hardwood floor, the sound jolting her out of her shocked state. She rushed to Oscar's side, her anger instantly replaced by horror and regret. She pressed her hands against the wound, desperately trying to stem the flow of blood. Oscar's breathing was labored, his skin growing pale with trembling hands. Octavia reached for her phone, dialing 911. Her voice shook as she gave the dispatcher their address, pleading for an ambulance to hurry. As she waited for help to arrive, she cradled Oscar's head in her lap, whispering a mixture of apologies and pleas for him to hold on. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Neighbors, alerted by the gunshot, began to gather outside. Through the window, Octavia could see curious faces peering in, their expressions shifting from concern to shock as they took in the scene. She heard muffled voices, someone shouting about calling the police. When the paramedics finally arrived, they worked swiftly to stabilize Oscar. Octavia watched, numb with shock as they loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to the waiting ambulance. As the sirens faded into the distance, Octavia found herself alone in the house, surrounded by the evidence of her actions. It wasn't long before the police arrived. Detective Mia Davis took charge of the scene, her keen eyes taking in every detail. As officers secured the area and began collecting evidence, Detective Davis approached Octavia, who sat motionless on the blood-stained couch. In a gentle but firm voice, Detective Davis informed Octavia of her rights and asked if she understood what had happened. Octavia, her voice barely audible, recounted the events of the day, the discovery of the affair, the confrontation, and the moment the gun went off. Throughout her statement, she seemed almost detached, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. As Octavia was led away in handcuffs, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. She caught glimpses of her neighbors watching from behind hastily drawn curtains, their faces a mix of horror and fascination. At the General Hospital, Oscar Fairweather clung to life in the intensive care unit. The bullet had missed his heart by mere inches, lodging dangerously close to his spine as he underwent multiple surgeries. A steady stream of colleagues and family friends visited their hushed conversations in the waiting room, filled with speculation and disbelief. Cordelia Prescott, racked with guilt and shame, attempted to visit her son-in-law but was turned away by the Fairweather family. She retreated to her cottage, refusing to answer calls or open her door. The weight of her role in the tragedy seemed to age her overnight, her once vibrant demeanor replaced by a haunted, hollow-eyed look. Detective Davis, meanwhile, delved deeper into the case. She interviewed friends, colleagues, and family members, piecing together the events that had led to that fateful night. The more she uncovered about the Fairweather family's history and the affair between Oscar and Cordelia, the more complex the case became. As the investigation progressed, public opinion in Creekside began to shift. What had initially been seen as a clear-cut case of attempted murder in a fit of rage was revealed to be a tragedy. Born of betrayal and shattered trust, the town found itself divided, with some sympathizing with Octavia's plight, while others condemned her actions as inexcusable regardless of the circumstances. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence came from an unexpected source. Octavia's best friend and fellow art teacher, Zara, came forward with a series of text messages. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, Octavia had confided her growing suspicions to Zara, detailing the signs of infidelity she had noticed. The messages revealed Octavia's emotional turmoil and her struggle to confront the truth, providing valuable insight into her state of mind. Inside the packed courtroom, the air was thick with tension as the judge called the proceedings to order. The prosecution, led by the ambitious District Attorney Vincent Harding, painted a picture of Octavia as a vengeful woman who had committed a premeditated act of violence. Harding argued that the shooting was not a crime of passion, but a calculated attempt to punish both her husband and her mother for their betrayal. Octavia's defense team, headed by the seasoned attorney, presented a different narrative. They portrayed Octavia as a victim of circumstances, a woman pushed to the brink by an unthinkable betrayal. Morales emphasized Octavia's impeccable character, her contributions to the community, and the extreme emotional distress she had been under at the time of the shooting. In their closing arguments, both the prosecution and defense made impassioned pleas to the jury. T.A. Harding emphasized the seriousness of the crime and the need for justice, while Morales urged the jurors to consider the extraordinary circumstances and Octavia's otherwise exemplary life. As the jury filed out to begin their deliberations, a hush fell over the courtroom. The fate of Octavia Fairweather now rested in their hands, and with it, the resolution of a tragedy that had shaken the town of Creekside to its core. After 3 days of intense deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. They found Octavia Fairweather guilty of aggravated assault, a lesser charge than the attempted murder the prosecution had pushed for. The courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps and murmurs as the verdict was read, with Octavia standing stoically beside her attorney. The judge, taking into account Octavia's previously unblemished record and the extraordinary circumstances of the case, sentenced her to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. Additionally, Octavia was mandated to undergo psychological counseling and complete an anger management program. The sentence was met with mixed reactions. Some felt it was too lenient given the severity, while others believed it appropriately balanced justice with compassion. As Octavia was led away from the courtroom, the weight of her actions and the long road ahead seemed to finally settle on her shoulders. Oscar, having recovered from his physical wounds but forever changed by the experience, had moved to a different state to start anew. He and Octavia had divorced during her incarceration, their communication limited to formal letters and occasional phone calls. Despite the pain of their shared past, there was a tentative forgiveness between them, born of mutual understanding and regret. Cordelia had retreated from public life entirely. She lived as a virtual recluse in her cottage, her only contact with the outside world. Being the occasional visit from a home health aide, the weight of her role in the tragedy had taken a severe toll on her health and spirit. As Creekside slowly heals and life moves forward, the story of Octavia, Oscar, and Cordelia remains a powerful reminder of how quickly and irrevocably lives can change. It challenges us to examine our own relationships, to value the trust placed in us by our loved ones, and to consider the far-reaching impacts of our choices. Case 1. In the quiet town of Terre Haute, Indiana, a case would unfold that would leave a lasting impact on its residents. The story of Jason Wheeler, a man who had grown up in the small town, was not one of wealth or privilege. It was a story marked by struggles, poor decisions, and a slow descent into a world of crime. Jason was born in 1986 to a modest family. His parents, both hard-working but struggling to make ends meet, did their best to provide for him and his 2 younger sisters. They lived in a small house on the edge of town, where the sound of traffic from the nearby interstate could often be heard at night. Jason had always been a quiet, introverted child. He preferred to stay inside, reading books or playing video games, rather than going outside to play with the other children in the neighborhood. His parents often worried about his lack of social interaction, but they believed he would eventually grow out of it. Unfortunately, as Jason entered his teenage years, his world began to unravel. It wasn't that Jason lacked intelligence. On the contrary, he had a sharp mind. But his environment, combined with a lack of guidance, led him down a path that would eventually entangle him in a web of criminal activity. By the time Jason turned 18, he had already gotten into trouble with the law on several occasions. His first arrest came at the age of 16, when he was caught stealing a car from a local dealership. Though it was a minor offense, it set the stage for a series of increasingly serious crimes. Over the next few years, Jason's criminal behavior escalated. He was involved in petty theft, drug possession, and eventually armed robbery. With each crime, he became more desperate, more reckless, as if he was searching for something, validation, a sense of control, or perhaps just a way out of the misery he had built for himself. Despite his criminal activity, Jason was often able to avoid significant jail time. His family, while disappointed, continued to support him, believing that one day he would turn things around. But by the time Jason was in his early 20s, his pattern of criminal behavior was well established. He had dropped out of high school, found work in dead-end jobs, and continued to make poor decisions that only worsened his situation. He had a few close friends, but even they began to distance themselves as Jason's behavior became more erratic and his temper more unpredictable. On the night of October 14, 2011, Jason committed a crime that would change his life forever. It was late, well after midnight, when he found himself walking through a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. He had been drinking heavily, and the alcohol had clouded his judgment. He had no real plan in mind, but the desire to do something, anything, had taken over. As Jason wandered through the neighborhood, his thoughts became jumbled, his mind racing with thoughts of his failures and frustrations. He didn't know what he was looking for, but his eyes landed on a small convenience store. It was one of the few businesses still open at that hour, and the parking lot was nearly empty. For a moment, Jason stood there, watching the fluorescent lights of the store flicker in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator units in the background. Without thinking, he walked toward the store, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, the store was quiet. There was only one clerk behind the counter, a young woman in her early 20s, who looked up in surprise as Jason entered. She greeted him with a friendly smile, but her expression quickly changed when she saw the look in his eyes. Jason was drunk, his movements slow and unsteady. He walked up to the counter, his hand shaking as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, silver handgun. The clerk froze. She had seen her fair share of troubled individuals come through the store, but nothing like this. Jason's eyes were wild, his hands trembling, and his voice was low but steady as he demanded money from the register. The woman's heart raced as she slowly opened the cash register, her hands shaking. Jason watched her closely, his finger twitching near the trigger. He wasn't thinking clearly, and the alcohol in his system only made the situation more volatile. The woman handed him the cash, but Jason didn't leave. He wasn't done. In a moment of panic, the woman reached for the store's phone, hoping to call for help. Before she could do so, Jason lunged forward, knocking the phone from her hand. The two struggled briefly, but in the end, it was Jason who was left standing. The woman fell to the ground, her head hitting the counter as she lost consciousness. Jason stood over her, panting heavily, his heart racing. For a moment, he simply stared at her, the weight of what he had just done crashing down on him. His mind was foggy, the alcohol clouding his judgment even further. The sirens in the distance began to wail, and panic overtook him. He grabbed the money and fled the store, running through the dark streets as the world around him blurred. The next morning, the small convenience store was a crime scene. Police arrived to find the young woman unconscious on the floor, a bump on her head where it had struck the counter. They immediately began to search for evidence, and it didn't take long for them to identify Jason as the perpetrator. He had been caught on the store's surveillance cameras, his face clearly visible. It was a crime that seemed to fit perfectly into the pattern of Jason's life, reckless, impulsive, and full of regret. The police quickly tracked him down, and within hours, Jason was arrested. He was charged with armed robbery, assault, and attempted murder. His trial was set to begin in the spring of 2012, but as the days passed, the weight of what he had done settled in. Jason realized, perhaps for the first time, the full extent of his actions. He had not just robbed the store, he had hurt someone who had done nothing wrong, someone who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. As he sat in the cold, sterile holding cell, Jason wondered how he had come to this point. How had he allowed himself to spiral so far into darkness? He had known right from wrong, but the urge to escape, to numb the pain of his life, had always been stronger. He had pushed away the people who cared about him, and in the end, all he had was a string of broken relationships and criminal charges. Jason's journey through the criminal justice system was just beginning. His case would become one of the most talked about in Terre Haute that year, and as the trial approached, Jason's family struggled to understand how their son had fallen so far. They had tried to help him, tried to intervene, but Jason had always been too proud, too stubborn, and now it seemed that it was too late. What would happen next for Jason was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The events of that night would haunt him forever. As the days passed in the holding cell, Jason's mind wandered. Every time the heavy metal door clanged shut behind him, his thoughts grew darker, pulling him into a sea of regret. He thought about his family, the people who had tried to support him throughout his troubled life. His mother, always so kind and patient, would visit him occasionally, her eyes filled with both love and disappointment. His father, a quiet man who had always worked hard to provide for his family, couldn't bring himself to speak much when he visited. Jason had seen the disappointment in his eyes. His father had once believed in him, had once thought that Jason could be someone better. But now, his father's silence felt like the loudest rejection. Jason had always known that his actions were a burden on his family, but standing in that cold cell, he finally understood the weight of what he had done. The guilt gnawed at him constantly, creeping into every corner of his mind. He wished he could go back, rewind time, and undo the moment he stepped into that store. But he knew that wasn't possible. The consequences of that night were irreversible. The trial began in the spring of 2012. The courtroom was packed with people who had heard about the crime and wanted to see justice served. Jason's face, still fresh in the memories of those who had witnessed the robbery, was plastered across every local news outlet. He was no longer just another troubled young man in Terre Haute. He was now a symbol of the consequences of poor choices, of a life spiraling out of control. The prosecution presented their case first. They had the evidence. The surveillance footage showing Jason entering the store, the footage showing him brandishing the gun, and the terrifying moment when he lunged at the clerk. The evidence was damning, and the prosecution painted a picture of a man who had acted in cold blood, motivated by desperation and anger. They spoke of the harm he had caused to the young woman, the clerk, who had been unable to defend herself as Jason held her at gunpoint. The woman, whose name was Emily, had suffered significant trauma from the incident. Not only had she been physically hurt, but the emotional scars were deep. She had been unable to return to work at the store for several weeks, and when she finally did, the fear of encountering a similar situation again lingered in the back of her mind. The prosecution made it clear that this was not just a robbery gone wrong. It was an assault that had left lasting consequences on an innocent person. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Jason's actions were the result of his troubled upbringing and his history of poor decisions. They spoke of his difficult childhood, his struggles with alcohol, and the lack of guidance that had shaped him into the person he had become. They claimed that Jason was not inherently violent, but had been overwhelmed by the circumstances of his life. They tried to paint a picture of a man who had lost his way, a man who had made one terrible mistake, but could be redeemed with the right help. Jason sat through the trial in silence, his eyes fixed on the floor most of the time. He didn't argue with the evidence, didn't try to dispute the charges. He knew the truth. He had done it. He had walked into that store with a plan, albeit a half-formed one, and he had followed through with it. There was no denying it. There was no excuse that could erase what had happened. As the trial continued, Jason's thoughts turned inward. He had spent so much of his life trying to avoid the truth, trying to escape from the consequences of his actions. But now, with the trial underway, he was faced with it all. The life he had tried to ignore, the choices he had made, and the people he had hurt, they were all coming to light. And no matter how much he wished he could undo it, he couldn't. The days stretched on, and Jason's lawyer worked hard to present a defense that would allow for a lighter sentence. But the prosecution was relentless. The weight of the crime hung heavily in the air, and it was clear that Jason was facing a harsh punishment. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had seen countless cases like his, listened carefully to both sides. She was known for being tough but fair, and Jason knew that whatever decision she made would be final. There would be no second chances. Throughout the trial, Jason's mind often returned to Emily, the clerk. He thought about the fear in her eyes when she had seen him with the gun. He thought about the way her hand trembled as she handed him the money, her fingers unsure but desperate to comply. He had done this to her. He had taken away her sense of safety, and for what? A few $100s? It seemed so trivial in retrospect, so pointless. But in that moment, under the weight of his own frustration and alcohol, it had felt necessary. Now, sitting in the courtroom, Jason realized how wrong he had been. The trial eventually came to an end, and it was time for the verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the judge prepared to speak. Jason's family sat in the back, his mother holding his father's hand tightly, her face pale and drawn. They had hoped for a miracle, for some glimmer of hope that their son could be saved. But deep down, they knew the reality. Jason had crossed a line, and the consequences would be severe. The judge delivered the verdict with a calm but firm voice. Jason Wheeler was found guilty on all charges: armed robbery, assault, and attempted murder. The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge continued, explaining the severity of the crime and the need for a sentence that would serve as a deterrent for others. Jason's heart sank as the judge spoke of the victim's suffering, the lasting impact of the crime on her life. Jason had been prepared for this moment, but the weight of the words still hit him like a hammer. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. It wasn't the death sentence, but it might as well have been. In many ways, Jason felt as though his life had already ended. The world outside the prison walls would no longer be his. He had ruined any chance he had of living a normal life, and the reality of his actions was more painful than anything else. In the days following the trial, Jason was transferred to the state prison in Terre Haute. It was a facility known for housing violent offenders, and Jason knew that he would be in for a tough time. But as he sat in the back of the police car, handcuffed and silent, he couldn't help but think that, in some strange way, prison was where he belonged. It was the logical consequence of a life built on bad choices. As Jason entered the prison gates, he knew that he would face many challenges. But perhaps the hardest challenge of all would be facing himself. The man he had become, the life he had led, it had all come down to this. And there was no escaping it now. As Jason entered the prison gates, a new chapter of his life began. A chapter marked by uncertainty, violence, and the harsh realities of life behind bars. The Terre Haute facility was known for its tough conditions, and Jason was keenly aware that his fate, from that point on, would be shaped by the environment he was about to enter. He was led into the intake area, a sterile and intimidating environment that smelled of antiseptic and sweat. The cold metal walls echoed with the sounds of clanging doors and muffled voices from the other side. His handcuffs dug into his wrists as he walked through the hallways, his mind racing. He thought about what was to come, the rough days, the new rules he'd have to learn, the people he'd have to navigate. There was no escaping this. He was here now, a part of a broken system, a cog in a machine that had been grinding for years. The intake officers went through their usual procedures, taking his fingerprints, asking for his identification, and processing his arrival. Jason had no idea what to expect. The officers spoke to him in the same monotone voice they used with everyone, their faces impassive as they conducted their work. He was just another number to them, another inmate who would eventually fade into the background of the prison's everyday life. Jason was then escorted to his cell. The narrow hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before him, each step heavy with the weight of the unknown. He could hear the distant clanging of metal doors and the murmurs of voices, but everything felt muffled, as though the world outside had faded into oblivion. As they approached his cell, Jason couldn't help but glance at the other inmates who had gathered by their own doors, their eyes curious, sizing him up. His cell was small, barely big enough for a bunk bed, a toilet, and a tiny sink. The walls were stained with years of grime, and the flickering light overhead cast long shadows that danced across the floor. It was a far cry from the comfort of his life before prison, but Jason knew he would have to make do. His new reality had no room for comfort. The door clanged shut behind him, and Jason took a deep breath. The sound of the lock clicking into place sent a shiver down his spine. He was truly alone now, trapped in a world he could no longer escape. He didn't know what to expect, but he was certain of one thing. Survival in this environment would require a new version of himself, someone tougher, someone who could hold his own. The first few weeks in prison were the hardest. Jason spent most of his time alone in his cell, trying to adjust to the rhythm of life behind bars. He quickly learned that there were unwritten rules in prison, rules that didn't come with a manual but were taught through experience. The inmates who had been there longer had a language of their own, a set of codes that helped them navigate the daily challenges of prison life. Jason had to learn fast. The days blended together as he adjusted to the harsh schedule. Wake up early, get in line for meals, and endure long hours of silence or the occasional confrontation. He quickly became aware of the other inmates, their personalities, their strengths, and their weaknesses. Some men tried to keep their heads down, avoiding attention, while others sought power, looking for any opportunity to dominate the weaker ones. Jason was just another face in the crowd, but he wasn't sure how long he could stay invisible. Soon, Jason learned that in prison, the biggest threat often came from within the walls. Violence was a constant presence, lurking just beneath the surface. Fights broke out regularly over small slights, over power struggles, and over misunderstandings. There was no room for weakness in this place, and Jason, despite his guilt and remorse, had to find a way to protect himself. He didn't want to become one of the violent men. He didn't want to lose his humanity in the cold, unforgiving world of the prison. But the longer he stayed, the more he realized that survival here meant adapting. It meant finding allies, learning how to defend himself, and navigating the complex social structure that ruled the prison yard. As the months passed, Jason became more accustomed to the rhythm of prison life. He learned who to trust and who to avoid. He made a few friends, but they were the kind of friends who helped each other out of necessity rather than genuine camaraderie. In prison, everyone had their own motives, their own reasons for being there. Some were there for violent crimes, others for drug offenses, and still others for theft or fraud. Jason was just one of many, another soul trapped in the system. But amid the harshness and brutality, Jason began to reflect on his past, on the choices he had made. He thought about the robbery and how it had started as an impulsive act, a desperate attempt to escape the life he had been living. At the time, it had seemed like a quick fix, a way to grab control of his life, but it had spiraled out of control. The pain he had caused others, especially Emily, weighed heavily on him. He could still see her face, her eyes wide with fear as he held the gun. The image haunted him, and there were nights when he couldn't sleep, when he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. Jason knew that he couldn't undo the past, but he also knew that he had to find a way to atone for his mistakes. The prison was full of men who had made mistakes, some small, some unforgivable. But Jason realized that his redemption didn't lie in escaping the punishment. It lay in accepting responsibility for his actions. In prison, that was the first step toward redemption. As the years went on, Jason worked hard to keep his head down and stay out of trouble. He stayed away from the gangs that formed in prison, focused on reading books and trying to improve himself. He joined a few educational programs, trying to earn his GED and build a skill set that might help him when he was eventually released. But even as he tried to move forward, the past continued to follow him. He had to face the truth of his crime every day, in every moment. And though he knew that he would never be able to truly escape the consequences of his actions, he held on to a sliver of hope that someday he might find a way to make things right, to earn back some measure of peace. Jason didn't know when or if that day would come, but for the first time since he walked into that store all those years ago, he felt a small flicker of hope. He didn't know how long it would last or where it would lead, but he was ready to face it, ready to do whatever he could to make things right. As the years went by in the penitentiary, Jason grew accustomed to the strict routines and the constant vigilance required to survive. He had learned how to blend in, how to be just another face in the crowd. But deep inside, he still longed for something more. He hadn't forgotten about Emily, the woman whose life he had shattered with his reckless actions. In the darkest corners of his mind, her face lingered like a ghost, reminding him of the pain he had caused. Jason's days consisted of the same monotonous routines: waking up early, standing in line for breakfast, cleaning his cell, and attending mandatory programs. The guards moved through the halls with an air of indifference, barely acknowledging the inmates, while the prisoners carried on with their own lives. Some read, some worked, and some spent their time plotting their next move. There was no escape from the grinding weight of time, and each day felt like a repeat of the last. But over the years, Jason had built a small sense of purpose within himself. He had become involved in a few educational programs, starting with his GED. At first, it had been just another way to pass the time, another distraction from the never-ending monotony of prison life. But soon, he realized how much he had missed learning, how much he had taken education for granted before everything had gone wrong. His teachers, though hardened by the system, were committed to helping the inmates better themselves. They saw the potential in their students, even if the world outside did not. Jason threw himself into his studies. He read anything he could get his hands on, from literature to history, philosophy to science. There was a sense of freedom and knowledge, a way to escape the confines of his physical reality, even if it was just for a few moments each day. But despite the education he was gaining, Jason knew that it wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed redemption, not just in the eyes of the world, but in his own eyes. The longer Jason stayed in prison, the more he understood that redemption wasn't a one-time event. It was a lifelong journey. It wasn't enough to just serve his sentence and walk out the door. He needed to change, to become a different person, someone who could hold his head up high, someone who could live with the mistakes he had made. He knew it wouldn't be easy. After all, he was surrounded by men who had committed terrible acts, who had lost their humanity in the process of surviving the brutality of the system. But Jason wasn't willing to let that happen to him. One day, as Jason was walking back from the library, he noticed something that stopped him dead in his tracks. Across the yard, he saw a familiar face, one that sent a chill down his spine. It was Marcus, the man who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time during the robbery. Jason had never seen Marcus again after the trial, but now, here he was, standing near the chain-link fence, talking with a few other inmates. It was as if time had frozen. For a moment, Jason couldn't breathe. The sight of Marcus brought a wave of guilt crashing over him. He had never truly apologized for what had happened that night, for what he had done to the man who had been caught in the crossfire of his foolishness. Seeing Marcus in the prison yard so close, yet so far, made Jason realize just how much he still had to atone for. The anger and frustration that had simmered inside him for years began to boil to the surface. He had to make things right. But how could he? After everything that had happened, could there ever be a way for him to undo the damage he had caused? Jason struggled with these thoughts for days. He watched Marcus from afar, too afraid to approach him. The idea of confronting his past, of facing the man who had been part of his crime, was terrifying. What if Marcus hated him? What if he saw Jason as nothing more than a criminal, a reminder of the violence that had ruined their lives? But Jason knew that he couldn't run from it anymore. He had to face Marcus, and more importantly, he had to face himself. If he was ever going to heal, if he was ever going to be free of the burden that weighed so heavily on his conscience, he had to take this step. It took weeks before Jason finally found the courage to approach Marcus. He had carefully thought out what he would say, rehearsing it in his mind, but when the time came, the words didn't come out the way he had planned. Instead, he stood there, looking at Marcus with a mix of guilt and sorrow, unsure of how to begin. Marcus looked at him, his face expressionless, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, followed by a look of wariness. Jason didn't know what to expect. He wasn't sure if Marcus even remembered him, but he had to try. "I'm sorry," Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I need you to know that I'm sorry for what happened. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't want to hurt anyone." Marcus didn't say anything at first. The silence between them stretched on, long enough for Jason to feel his heart pounding in his chest. He thought for a moment that Marcus might just walk away, that the years of silence had hardened him to the point of no forgiveness. But then Marcus spoke. "I remember you," Marcus said quietly, his voice rough. You think I don't know what you did to me? You think I've forgotten? I haven't." Jason's heart sank. He had expected anger, but hearing the bitterness in Marcus's voice made him realize how deep the wound went. The damage he had caused wasn't something that could be fixed with a few words. It wasn't something that could be undone. But even in the harshness of Marcus's words, Jason heard something else, a hint of understanding, a flicker of acknowledgement. Marcus wasn't offering forgiveness, but he wasn't closing the door either. And in that moment, Jason understood. Redemption wasn't about making things right with others. It was about making peace with himself, accepting the consequences of his actions, and learning to live with them. The conversation didn't last long. Marcus walked away, and Jason stood there, feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. He knew the road to redemption wouldn't be easy, but now he felt like he was on the right path. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about owning it, accepting it, and learning to move forward despite it. As Jason walked back to his cell that day, he felt a shift within himself. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough. He had taken a step forward, a step toward healing. The guilt still lingered, but it no longer consumed him. He had made a choice, and in that choice, he had found a small sliver of peace. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but for Jason, nothing ever felt quite the same. The encounter with Marcus had altered something within him, shifting his perspective on the life he was trying to rebuild. He was still incarcerated, of course, still paying for the choices he had made, but the guilt that once gnawed at him so relentlessly was now tempered by something else. A quiet resolve, a commitment to changing who he was, even if it was only for his own sake. Jason had learned to occupy his mind with more than just his own regrets. He buried himself in his studies, read books that opened his mind to new worlds, new philosophies, and new ways of thinking. The more he learned, the more he realized how little he had understood about life and about the impact of his actions. It wasn't just the crime that haunted him, but the realization that he had once lived so thoughtlessly, so consumed by selfish desires and reckless ambition. He often thought back to the day when everything had changed, the night of the robbery. It had been a simple plan, a rash decision fueled by desperation and ignorance. But now, in the quiet solitude of his cell, he saw the disaster it had set into motion, the ripple effect that had destroyed lives in ways he couldn't have imagined. The most difficult part of his incarceration, however, wasn't the isolation or the daily grind of prison life. It was the knowledge that he could never fully make amends. The family he had torn apart, the friends who had abandoned him, and Marcus, the man he had hurt so deeply, would never see the world the same way again. Jason could apologize until his voice grew hoarse, but the consequences of his actions would forever be etched into their lives. Still, he couldn't let that stop him. He had to try. Even if it was just a small effort, even if it was just a drop in the ocean, Jason believed that he could at least offer something. An apology, a gesture, a small act of kindness that could show he was different from the man he had been. His chance came one chilly autumn day, just as the leaves outside the prison yard began to turn a rich orange. Jason had been assigned to a work detail in the prison kitchen, a task he didn't mind. It gave him something to do, something productive, and it kept his mind from wandering back to darker thoughts. As he worked with a few other inmates, chopping vegetables and preparing meals for the prison population. A guard entered the kitchen with a man in tow. Jason barely glanced up at first, absorbed in his work, but then he heard the familiar voice, clear and steady, though a little older than it had been years ago. It was Marcus. He was standing near the door, hands cuffed behind his back, talking to the guard in a calm, measured voice. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he realized that Marcus had been brought into the prison, though he couldn't fathom why. His mind raced, wondering if this was another twist of fate, another moment where he would have to face the consequences of his actions in a new and unexpected way. Marcus wasn't in the same section of the prison as Jason. He was in a different security tier altogether, but he had been transferred to the kitchen for some unknown reason. Jason had no idea how long Marcus had been in prison or what had brought him here, but he couldn't help but wonder if their paths were destined to cross again. As the guard ushered Marcus to a workstation across the room, Jason's hands shook slightly. He had to face him again, had to confront the man who had been so deeply affected by his choices. But this time, Jason wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. He couldn't just apologize again, couldn't pretend that everything could be fixed with words. And yet, he couldn't ignore Marcus, couldn't simply let him slip into the background of his life without addressing the reality of their shared past. The next few hours felt like an eternity as Jason tried to focus on his work while stealing glances at Marcus from across the room. The silence between them was heavy, thick with years of unspoken words. Jason wanted to reach out, wanted to say something that would bridge the gap between them, but what could he possibly say? The years of separation had left them both changed in ways that couldn't be undone. By the time the work detail was over, Jason had worked himself into a frenzy of indecision. He needed to do something, anything, to make up for the hurt he had caused. But what? When the last bell rang, signaling the end of the workday, Jason lingered in the kitchen, watching as Marcus gathered his things and prepared to leave. His heart pounded in his chest, and his palms were slick with sweat. This was it. If he didn't act now, he might never get another chance. Without thinking, Jason approached Marcus as he was walking toward the exit. His footsteps were measured and deliberate, but his mind was racing. He didn't know what he would say, didn't know if Marcus would even want to hear it. But Jason couldn't let this opportunity slip by. "Marcus," Jason called softly, his voice carrying across the room. Marcus froze, his body tensing as he turned to face Jason. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but there was also something else, something unreadable. For a moment, they simply stood there, locked in silence, until Marcus spoke. "What do you want, Jason?" His voice was low, guarded, but not without a hint of weariness. Jason took a deep breath, steeling himself for the words that had been stuck in his throat for so long. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I know it's not enough, but I owe you that much." Marcus looked at him for a long moment, his face expressionless. It seemed as if he was weighing the sincerity of Jason's words, trying to decide whether or not they were worth acknowledging. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Marcus nodded once, sharply. "I know," he said simply, before turning and walking away, disappearing through the door. Jason stood there for a moment, the weight of the encounter settling over him like a blanket. It wasn't the grand reconciliation he had imagined in his mind. It wasn't the resolution he had hoped for, but it was something. It was a step toward healing, toward making peace with a past that he couldn't change. For the first time in years, Jason felt like he was finally moving forward. Jason stood frozen in the cold, sterile hallway, the echoes of Marcus's footsteps gradually fading into the distance. The encounter had been brief, too brief, perhaps, but for Jason it was enough. He had finally broken the silence that had hung between them for so long. And while he couldn't change the past or undo the damage he had caused, he realized that he had done what he could to acknowledge it. That was the first step. But as the days passed, Jason couldn't help but feel that the real work was just beginning. He had apologized. He had faced his demons, if only for a fleeting moment. But now, he had to prove to himself that he wasn't just a man of words. He had to become a man of actions, someone worthy of redemption. The time he spent in prison wasn't just about serving his sentence. It was about confronting the deep-seated parts of himself that had once led him to a path of crime and violence. He began attending therapy sessions, speaking to a counselor who helped him unpack the layers of anger, resentment, and fear that had built up inside him over the years. Through long conversations, he started to understand that much of his behavior had been a direct result of his upbringing, a childhood marked by neglect and hardship. Jason had grown up in a broken home. His father had been a violent drunk, and his mother had been emotionally distant. often leaving him to fend for himself. From a young age, Jason learned that survival was about taking what you could get, doing whatever it took to escape the harsh realities of his environment. It wasn't until he was much older that he realized just how deeply these formative years had shaped his worldview. He had spent so much of his life believing that the world was out to get him, and in turn, he became someone who took what he wanted without regard for the consequences. Now, as he sat in his prison cell, with the world behind bars and no way to escape, he began to understand that this mindset, the one that had led him to crime, wasn't the answer. The walls that once felt like a prison had become a strange kind of sanctuary, a place for introspection, where he could begin to rebuild himself. The counselor, a middle-aged woman named Linda, had become a key figure in Jason's transformation. She was patient with him, even when he was at his lowest, and she never judged him for the things he had done. Instead, she guided him through the difficult process of self-reflection, helping him unpack the layers of pain that had accumulated over the years. One afternoon, after a particularly emotional session, Jason sat on his bed, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He had learned so much about himself, but it wasn't enough. He still had a long road ahead of him. His past actions haunted him, and he knew that he would have to do more than just acknowledge his wrongdoings. He would need to take concrete steps to make amends, even if those steps were small. Jason began volunteering for various programs within the prison, teaching literacy classes to fellow inmates, helping others prepare for their GED exams. At first, it had been a way to pass the time, but slowly, he began to see it as something more. Each time he helped someone, each time he shared what he had learned, he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. In those moments, he realized that the best way to make up for his past mistakes was to help others, to use his experiences to guide them away from the same pitfalls he had fallen into. It wasn't easy. The prison environment was still a brutal, unforgiving place. The other inmates were often skeptical of his newfound approach to life, and many saw him as weak for attempting to change. Some mocked him, others ignored him, but Jason kept pushing forward. He didn't need their approval. He only needed to stay true to himself and the lessons he was learning. Meanwhile, his thoughts continued to drift back to Marcus. He hadn't seen him since that brief encounter in the kitchen. He had no idea where Marcus was, what he had been through, or whether their paths would cross again. But Jason couldn't shake the feeling that their story was far from over. Several months passed, and Jason found himself in a routine. He was no longer the same man who had walked into the prison with a heart full of anger and regret. The work he was doing, whether it was teaching, volunteering, or simply reflecting on his past, had begun to reshape him. But there were still nights when the weight of his guilt would crush him, when the memories of his past would flood back with such intensity that he felt as if he were drowning. On one such night, as the prison lights dimmed and the sounds of the guards' footsteps echoed through the halls, Jason sat by his cell's small window, staring out at the darkened sky. His thoughts returned to Marcus once more, and for the first time in weeks, he felt the urge to reach out again. It was an impulse he couldn't ignore. He knew it might be pointless, that Marcus might not even remember him or care about the apology Jason had offered. But there was a part of him, something deep inside, that felt it was necessary. He needed closure, even if it wasn't the kind he expected. The next morning, Jason approached the prison warden with a request. He asked if he could write a letter to Marcus, if it was possible to make contact with him. The warden, after a brief pause, agreed, but under the condition that it was reviewed before being sent. Jason was grateful for the opportunity, though he didn't know what he would say. When he sat down to write the letter, his hand trembled slightly, but he forced himself to be honest, raw, and unflinching. He wrote about the mistakes he had made, the ways in which he had wronged Marcus, and how deeply sorry he was for the pain he had caused. It wasn't a long letter, just a few paragraphs, but it came from the heart, and for Jason, that was all that mattered. He sealed the envelope and handed it over to the warden, uncertain of what would come next. Days passed before Jason received a response. He had almost forgotten about the letter when one afternoon, a guard approached his cell with a piece of paper in hand. It was from Marcus. Jason opened it slowly, almost afraid to read what it might say. But as he unfolded the paper, he saw only a few words written in neat handwriting. "It's never too late to change. I hope you're doing well. Stay strong." Jason stared at the words for a long time, the weight of them sinking in. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, and it wasn't an answer to all of his questions, but it was enough. It was a sign that Marcus had heard him, that he had understood Jason's apology in his own way. And in that moment, Jason knew that his journey was far from over. There would still be obstacles to overcome, both inside and outside of prison. But he had taken the first step toward healing, and that was something he could carry with him, no matter what the future held. Case 2. In 2014, Iowa was shaken by a case that became one of the most mysterious and troubling criminal investigations in the state's history. The case involved a man named Brian McAllister, a 42-year-old resident of Des Moines. Brian was well known in his community, but not for reasons one might assume. He was a quiet man, one who often kept to himself, spending most of his time at home, avoiding large gatherings. However, behind the quiet exterior, something darker was brewing within his mind, something that, over time, would unravel the fabric of his life and the lives of those around him. Brian was employed as a construction worker, often working long hours on various projects throughout the city. His colleagues knew him as a hard worker, diligent and focused. Yet, over the past few years, his demeanor had changed. He had grown more withdrawn, less engaged with others. His once present smile had faded into a stoic expression, and he became a ghost of the man he once was. His neighbors could often hear strange noises late at night, muffled sounds that they dismissed as just the noises of a man working on home improvement projects in his garage. But in the summer of 2014, everything changed. It was on one ordinary Thursday evening that Brian McAllister became the center of a criminal investigation that would soon captivate the entire state of Iowa. What began as a routine missing persons case would eventually turn into a tangled web of lies, secrets, and murder. The story started with the disappearance of a local woman named Rebecca Carver, a 34-year-old mother of two who had lived just a few blocks away from Brian. Rebecca was known in the community as a friendly and approachable woman. She worked as a waitress at a local diner, and her warm smile had made her beloved by all who knew her. But one night, Rebecca failed to return home from work. Her children waited for her at the front door, but she never arrived. Her husband, Steve Carver, immediately called the authorities when he realized something was wrong. The police began their investigation, initially treating Rebecca's disappearance as a possible case of her leaving voluntarily. However, as the hours turned into days, the situation took a darker turn. The Carver family, devastated by their missing loved one, desperately reached out to the community for help. Flyers were posted, social media pages were flooded with messages, and local news outlets began reporting on the missing woman. The case became one that not only saddened the small town, but also puzzled the police. It wasn't long before Brian McAllister's name surfaced in the investigation. A friend of the Carvers had remembered seeing Brian speaking with Rebecca on the night she disappeared. The interaction was brief, but the fact that the two were seen together sparked suspicion. The police began to look into Brian's movements on the night of Rebecca's disappearance. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Brian had lied about his whereabouts. He initially claimed he had been home that night, working on his garage, but further evidence began to suggest otherwise. Surveillance footage from nearby gas stations and stores revealed that Brian had been in the area close to Rebecca's home that evening, contradicting his story. Furthermore, his phone records showed unusual activity, including several unanswered calls made from his phone to Rebecca's, which only deepened the mystery. The police dug deeper, going through Brian's history. They discovered a troubled past, filled with brushes with the law. He had been arrested in the past for minor offenses, but nothing had ever indicated that he was capable of something as severe as the disappearance of Rebecca Carver. Still, there was a feeling that something was wrong, that there was more to Brian McAllister than met the eye. As the investigation progressed, more unsettling details emerged about Brian's personal life. Neighbors recalled seeing him arguing with his wife on several occasions, and some even reported hearing loud crashes coming from his home in the middle of the night. His wife, who had been supportive of him for years, seemed to have grown distant from him in the months leading up to Rebecca's disappearance. She was often seen in tears, and her once optimistic demeanor had turned cold and withdrawn. Despite this, there were no concrete links between Brian and Rebecca's disappearance, at least not until a breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A local resident had been walking his dog near the woods on the outskirts of town when he stumbled upon a piece of evidence that would change the course of the investigation. Hidden beneath a pile of fallen leaves, the man discovered Rebecca's handbag, which contained her ID, cell phone, and a few personal belongings. The discovery was chilling, but it also confirmed the police's worst fears. Something had happened to Rebecca. The investigation took a turn when Brian was officially named a suspect in the case. The police began to track his every move, and soon, they discovered something even more unsettling. A hidden compartment in Brian's garage was found, one that contained items that could only be described as disturbing. Inside were tools, pieces of clothing, and other items that appeared to have been recently used. The police believed they had finally found the link between Brian and Rebecca, but they needed more evidence to make an arrest. As the days passed, tension in the small town grew. The community was in shock, unable to understand how someone they had known for years could be involved in such a horrific crime. For the Carver family, the pain of not knowing what had happened to Rebecca was unbearable. They held on to hope, praying that she would be found alive, but deep down, they feared the worst. It was during this time that the police received a tip from an anonymous source, someone who claimed to have overheard a conversation between Brian and a friend. The tipster reported that Brian had confessed to having a violent altercation with Rebecca on the night she disappeared. The details were vague, but it was enough to convince the police that they were closing in on the truth. What happened next would change everything. The investigation entered a tense phase. The Carver family continued their daily lives, clinging to the hope that Rebecca would eventually return, but every passing day only deepened their despair. The community, once a place of quiet comfort, had become a hotbed of rumors and anxiety. Neighbors who had once shared friendly waves across the street now avoided eye contact, wary of each other as suspicion hung in the air like an ominous cloud. Despite the mounting evidence and growing suspicions surrounding Brian McAllister, the police faced the challenge of solidifying their case. They had the handbag, they had the tip-off, and they had the surveillance footage that contradicted Brian's alibi, but there was still no concrete evidence linking him directly to Rebecca's disappearance. Without that, an arrest couldn't be made. Without it, there was a looming sense of helplessness among the investigators. As the police continued to dig deeper into Brian's past, they found that his life was a mosaic of missed opportunities and unresolved frustrations. Brian had grown up in a broken home, one where his father had abandoned the family when he was young, and his mother struggled to keep them afloat. His early years had been marred by neglect and a sense of loneliness that followed him into adulthood. He never seemed to form lasting relationships, and although he managed to hold down jobs, he never found a sense of fulfillment. Brian's quiet demeanor and reluctance to engage with others were often misinterpreted as shyness, but those who knew him better recognized something else beneath the surface. There was a sense of simmering rage within him, a darkness he seemed to keep locked away. His marriage had become strained over the years, and while he never raised his voice in public, his wife often spoke of how unpredictable he had become at home. Small disagreements would escalate quickly into violent outbursts, and his anger seemed to be triggered by the most trivial things. The more the police learned about Brian, the more they began to suspect that his frustrations had reached a boiling point. Rebecca Carver, with her friendly and approachable nature, might have unwittingly become a target for Brian's anger, whether directly or in a way that made sense only to his troubled mind. In the days following the discovery of Rebecca's handbag, the authorities received another crucial piece of information. A man named Jared Bellamy, a longtime friend of Brian's, came forward with startling information. He admitted that he had been talking to Brian the night Rebecca disappeared. According to Jared, Brian had confided in him about a heated argument he had with Rebecca. The argument, he claimed, was over something trivial, though Brian had become visibly agitated while recounting it. Jared, who had known Brian for years, was worried about him. He said that Brian had become increasingly unpredictable over the past few months, his behavior shifting from calm to erratic in a matter of seconds. Still, Jared didn't think Brian was capable of something violent. He dismissed his friend's behavior as mere frustration with his life. But then, Jared overheard something that chilled him to the core. Brian had mentioned, in passing, how much he hated Rebecca for her perfect life. He expressed envy over her ability to move freely through the world, something that Brian felt he could never attain. The conversation, according to Jared, had taken an unsettling turn when Brian casually remarked that, if she wasn't around, things would be easier. Jared didn't take it seriously at first, assuming it was just a momentary expression of anger. But now, hearing about Rebecca's disappearance, he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The police interviewed Jared several times, and his testimony became a key piece of the puzzle. It provided a motive for Brian's actions, something that had previously been missing from the case. It also created a direct link between Brian's thoughts and Rebecca's fate. The detectives now had something they could work with: anger, envy, and a history of troubled behavior. In the days that followed, the police returned to Brian's home with renewed focus. They searched the property again, this time with a more experienced team of forensic experts. They scoured every inch of his garage, his house, and the surrounding grounds, looking for anything that might have been overlooked during previous searches. The breakthrough came when a set of investigators stumbled upon a small, inconspicuous shed in the back of Brian's property. The shed, which had appeared to be nothing more than a storage unit, had been locked at the time of previous searches. When the police managed to gain access to it, they found evidence that sent shockwaves through the entire investigation. Inside the shed were several items that seemed out of place: old clothing, a torn-up photograph of a woman, and a small box containing various objects that had been carefully arranged. Among these items, however, was something much more significant. A blood-stained piece of fabric was found, and forensic analysis quickly confirmed that it matched Rebecca's clothing. Additionally, a small knife was discovered, hidden beneath a pile of old tools. It was enough to make the police confident that they were closing in on the truth. They had found tangible evidence that linked Brian to Rebecca's disappearance. The discovery of the fabric and the knife were crucial, and they solidified their suspicion that Brian McAllister had been involved in something far darker than anyone had imagined. The following days were filled with intense questioning, surveillance, and mounting pressure on Brian. He remained calm during his interrogations, maintaining his story that he had nothing to do with Rebecca's disappearance. However, the weight of the evidence against him was growing stronger. His alibi had unraveled, his movements had been traced, and now there was undeniable forensic evidence pointing to his involvement. Despite the mounting pressure, Brian refused to confess. He maintained his innocence, insisting that he had no idea how Rebecca's belongings had ended up on his property. But the truth was becoming more and more apparent. As the investigation continued, the community of Des Moines was forced to grapple with the horrifying possibility that someone they had known for years, someone they had trusted, was capable of such a crime. The fear and suspicion that had taken root in the town only intensified as the evidence continued to mount. For the Carver family, the waiting was unbearable. They had spent days and nights hoping for answers, praying that Rebecca would return home safely. But as each new piece of evidence was revealed, it became increasingly clear that the outcome would not be what they had hoped. The authorities, now convinced of Brian's involvement, were preparing for the next phase of the investigation. They were ready to make an arrest, but they knew that it would not bring back Rebecca. It would not erase the pain and heartbreak that the Carver family had endured. But it was a step toward justice, a step that would bring some closure, even if it came too late. It was on a cool September morning that the arrest was made. Brian McAllister was taken into custody without incident, his expression as stoic as ever. The quiet man who had once lived among them as a neighbor and colleague was now a criminal, a man whose secrets had been exposed for all to see. His arrest sent shockwaves through the town, but for the Carver family, it was just the beginning of a long and painful journey toward healing. The trial that followed would reveal more details about Brian's troubled past and the dark forces that had driven him to commit the unimaginable. But for now, the people of Des Moines could only take solace in the fact that the man responsible for Rebecca's disappearance was no longer free. The investigation was over, but the scars left behind would take much longer to heal. As for Brian, his life had come to an end, at least the life he had known. The man who had once been a quiet and unremarkable figure in the community was now infamous, a reminder of how darkness can sometimes hide in plain sight. And for the Carver family, the pain of their loss would never truly fade, but at least they had an answer that, though painful, allowed them to begin the difficult process of moving forward. The days that followed Brian's arrest were filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow for the Carver family. Their daughter, their sister, was still missing, but they now had a sense of direction, an understanding that the man they had once trusted, their neighbor and community member, was responsible for the tragedy that had shattered their lives. But while the police had their suspect, there was still so much left unanswered. Rebecca's body had not been found. In the early days of the investigation, the police had combed through wooded areas, fields, and abandoned properties in an attempt to locate her. They had used dogs, drones, and every available tool, but so far, nothing had turned up. The discovery of Brian's involvement in the crime had been a turning point, but it only opened up more questions. Where was Rebecca? What had happened to her after she left her parents' home that fateful evening? The answer came nearly a week later. Detectives had obtained a search warrant for Brian's phone records and had discovered something that would change the course of the investigation. A series of cryptic text messages had been exchanged between Brian and an unknown contact on the night of Rebecca's disappearance. The content of the messages was unclear, but what stood out was the timestamp. They were sent shortly after Rebecca was last seen. It wasn't just that Brian had been in contact with someone, it was that he had sent multiple texts, all with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. The police moved quickly. They traced the phone number to a burner phone, one that was registered under a fake name. It took days of digging, but they eventually discovered that the phone had been used to communicate with a network of individuals who had ties to organized crime in the area. This revelation left the detectives in a state of confusion. Why had Brian, a man with no apparent criminal connections, been in contact with people involved in such dangerous dealings? What did this have to do with Rebecca's disappearance? As the investigation deepened, it became apparent that Brian's connection to these criminal elements was not incidental. Over the years, he had found himself entangled in a series of bad decisions, small gambling debts, unpaid loans, and dealings with shady characters. Brian, it seemed, had become someone who, once faced with the pressure of his spiraling life, was willing to go to extreme lengths to escape the consequences of his own actions. Detectives started to piece together a chilling picture of what might have happened the night Rebecca disappeared. It was no longer just a crime of passion or misplaced anger. It seemed to be part of a darker, more calculated scheme. It was a former associate of Brian's who would ultimately provide the most valuable insight. Adam Clark had once been one of Brian's closest friends, though their relationship had soured over time. Adam had known about Brian's gambling issues and the increasing pressure he faced from people who expected him to pay off his debts. But it wasn't until the arrest that Adam understood the true extent of Brian's troubles. In a tense meeting with detectives, Adam revealed that Brian had approached him in the days leading up to Rebecca's disappearance, asking for help with a job. At the time, Adam had dismissed it as another of Brian's desperate attempts to get out of trouble. But looking back, Adam now realized that the job was not just a financial transaction. It was something far more sinister. Brian had needed someone to help him find a way to make a large sum of money disappear, and he had come up with a plan. He had spoken vaguely about using Rebecca as leverage. "I didn't know what he was planning," Adam confessed to the detectives. "But the more he talked, the more I realized he was in deep with people who weren't just going to let him slip away. I didn't think he would actually go through with it. Not Rebecca. She was just a kid." Adam's revelation turned the investigation on its head. Brian had been under immense pressure to resolve his financial troubles, but his solution had been terrifyingly simple. Take someone close to him and use them as a bargaining chip to get out of his debts. The more detectives learned about Brian's interactions with organized crime figures, the clearer the picture became. He had been deeply in debt to these individuals, and they had been pressuring him for months. But when Brian realized that there was no way out of the hole he had dug for himself, he made a fateful decision. Rebecca, who had always been friendly to him, had become an easy target. In his mind, she was expendable, a way to secure his freedom from the debtors who had been breathing down his neck. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the search for Rebecca became even more urgent. The police now believed that Brian had been in contact with a group of men who had helped him kidnap her. They also suspected that Rebecca had been taken to a location on the outskirts of town, a secluded spot that Brian knew well. It was a place where he could hide her long enough for the criminals to get what they wanted. The detectives put together a team and began their search in earnest. They combed through the area, checking abandoned houses, empty fields, and any location where someone could hide a person without being noticed. The clock was ticking, and with each passing day, hope seemed to slip further away. On the 5th day of the renewed search, they found something. It was a small, dilapidated cabin on the edge of a dense forest. The structure had been abandoned for years, but someone had recently been inside. The door was ajar, and as the police entered the cabin, they found the remnants of a crime scene. A blood-stained blanket, signs of a struggle, and most damning of all, a piece of jewelry that belonged to Rebecca. The discovery of the cabin was a turning point. It provided definitive evidence that Rebecca had been held captive at that location, and it confirmed the worst fears of her family. The question now was whether they would find her alive or dead. The discovery also led the police to make another arrest, one that would add another layer to the already complex case. One of the men Brian had been in contact with was arrested as a part of the organized crime ring. His name was Carlos Mendez, and he had been involved in a string of criminal activities in the area, including human trafficking and drug smuggling. Carlos was linked to the group that Brian had been trying to impress, and it was clear now that Brian had been trying to prove himself to these dangerous individuals. Carlos Mendez's arrest led to a wealth of information, and in the days that followed, several more arrests were made. The police had uncovered a network of criminals operating in the shadows of Des Moines, people who had been exploiting individuals like Brian for years. It was a network that had ties to dangerous activities, and one that now had to be dismantled piece by piece. But the investigation into Rebecca's disappearance wasn't over. It was just getting started. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of the search for Rebecca continued to hang over Des Moines. Despite the extensive search efforts, there was still no sign of her. The cabin had provided a crucial lead, but it had not led to a definitive discovery of her whereabouts. The community, once filled with a sense of normalcy, had become a place of tension. People whispered in the streets, and the local news stations played the same heartbreaking footage every evening. The face of Rebecca Carver, a young woman whose life had been abruptly stolen from her, stared back from every screen, her absence a hole in the lives of those who knew her. The police were under immense pressure. The trail was growing colder, and each day that passed without finding Rebecca felt like another loss. Yet, they couldn't give up. They couldn't let go of the hope that somehow, somewhere, there would be a breakthrough. In the midst of this uncertainty, new evidence began to emerge, bringing with it a mix of dread and hope. The breakthrough came when one of the individuals arrested in connection to Brian's crime ring, a man named Ethan Walsh, made a deal with the authorities. Ethan was a low-level enforcer for the network Brian had gotten tangled up with, and his position in the criminal operation was tenuous at best. It didn't take much for the detectives to convince him to cooperate. Ethan wasn't a hardened criminal. He was a man who had made a series of bad choices, each one leading him deeper into a world he hadn't been prepared for. When the pressure from law enforcement mounted, Ethan saw the opportunity to escape the nightmare he had been living. He was granted a deal in exchange for his cooperation, but the price for his freedom came at the expense of his soul. It was during a lengthy interrogation that Ethan revealed the location where he believed Rebecca had been taken after the cabin. His confession was both shocking and heartbreaking. According to Ethan, Rebecca had been moved several days after she had been held at the cabin. Her captors, fearing that the investigation was closing in on them, had decided to relocate her to a new location, a remote farmhouse on the outskirts of the city. "Why are you telling us this now?" one of the detectives had asked him, his voice cold, barely masking the disdain he felt for Ethan's involvement in such a horrific crime. I never wanted to be part of this," Ethan had replied, his voice shaking. "I thought it would be another job, another simple thing, but when they started talking about Rebecca, it was too much. I couldn't keep doing it." The confession was enough to send the detectives into action. Within hours, they had assembled a team and headed to the farmhouse. The location was difficult to reach, tucked away in the rolling hills of rural Iowa, far from the eyes of the public. The farmhouse had been abandoned for years, its walls weathered and its windows shattered. It seemed like the perfect hiding place for anyone trying to remain undetected. But the detectives were hopeful that they would finally find the answers they had been desperately seeking. As they approached the farmhouse, their hearts raced with anticipation. The air was thick with the weight of the moment. This could be the breakthrough they had been waiting for. They entered the building with caution, their flashlights illuminating the dark corners of the abandoned structure. The silence was deafening, and each creak of the floorboards beneath their feet felt like an eternity. The first room they checked was empty. The second room was the same. But in the third, they found something that made their blood run cold. There, lying in the corner of a dilapidated bedroom, was a bundle of clothes and blankets. The figure was curled up in a fetal position, and for a brief moment, the detectives feared the worst. They approached cautiously, their hearts pounding in their chests. But as they drew closer, they realized with a mixture of relief and horror that the figure was indeed Rebecca, alive, but barely. Her body was weak, her face pale, and her eyes were clouded with confusion and fear. She had been held captive for weeks, isolated from the world, but she was still alive. It was a miracle, one that brought a sense of hope to her family, but it was also a reminder of the horrors she had endured during her captivity. Rebecca was rushed to the hospital immediately. Her family, who had been holding on to a fragile thread of hope, received the news with a mixture of joy and heartbreak. They had their daughter back, but she had been irrevocably changed by the ordeal she had survived. The doctors and medical staff worked tirelessly to stabilize Rebecca's condition. The physical trauma was extensive, but it was the emotional scars that would take the longest to heal. She had been subjected to unimaginable abuse, both physical and psychological, and the road to recovery would be long and difficult. But the fact that she had survived the nightmare that had been her life for the past several weeks was a testament to her strength and resilience. As Rebecca slowly regained her strength, the investigation into her abduction continued. The discovery of her location had raised more questions than answers. Why had she been held for so long? Who had been responsible for her captivity? And what were their motives? The answers were still elusive, but with Rebecca's testimony, the police hoped to uncover the truth. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca's story began to unfold. The details of her time in captivity were difficult for her to recount, but she bravely shared what she could remember. She described the fear, the isolation, and the sense of helplessness that had consumed her during her time with her captors. She had been kept in a small, locked room, only allowed out to be moved from one place to another. The food had been scarce, and the psychological torment had been even worse. Her captors had used threats and manipulation to keep her in line, and they had made it clear that there was no way out. It became clear that Rebecca's ordeal had been a part of a much larger criminal operation. The people who had taken her were not just interested in her as a bargaining chip for Brian's debts. They were using her as part of a much broader scheme involving human trafficking. The crime ring that Brian had been connected to was far more expansive than anyone had realized, and it was clear that Rebecca had just been one of many victims. The investigation now shifted into overdrive. The police had uncovered a trail of destruction, one that stretched far beyond the borders of Des Moines. With Rebecca's help, they were able to trace the criminal network back to its origins, identifying key players and bringing them to justice. It was a process that would take months, but slowly, piece by piece, the police dismantled the operation. The Carver family, though still grieving the trauma their daughter had endured, found solace in the fact that her ordeal had helped expose a vast and dangerous criminal network. They knew that Rebecca's strength in surviving and speaking out had saved countless others from suffering the same fate. It was a small comfort, but it was a comfort nonetheless. As for Brian, his fate was sealed. He had been responsible for Rebecca's abduction, and he had played a central role in the criminal activities that had shattered the lives of so many. The charges against him were numerous, and he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For Rebecca, the road to recovery was long and difficult, but with the support of her family and the knowledge that her suffering had led to the dismantling of a dangerous criminal operation, she found the strength to heal. Her story was one of survival, of endurance in the face of unspeakable horror, and of the power of truth to bring light to even the darkest of places. Rebecca's healing was a slow and deliberate process. As she slowly regained her strength, her family was there for her every step of the way. Her mother, in particular, had been a constant presence by her side, her support unwavering. The love between them was palpable, as if it had been a thread that connected them even during the darkest moments of Rebecca's captivity. Rebecca spent weeks in therapy, both physical and emotional. The hospital staff worked tirelessly to help her recover physically, but they also recognized the importance of addressing the trauma that had taken root deep within her. Every session with the counselor was an emotional hurdle, but Rebecca faced it with a bravery that impressed even the most seasoned professionals. She didn't speak much in the beginning. There were moments when the words simply wouldn't come. But when they did, the rawness of her experience spilled out in a torrent of grief and rage, sorrow and helplessness. Yet, through it all, there was something else, an undeniable will to survive, to rebuild her life. Her family, too, faced the challenge of understanding what Rebecca had gone through. They had known their daughter as a strong-willed, independent young woman, but what had happened to her had changed her in ways they couldn't fully comprehend. The trauma had altered Rebecca, leaving scars on her mind that would take a lifetime to heal. Still, they tried to support her in the best way they knew how, understanding that the road ahead would be filled with ups and downs. Rebecca's father, once a stern figure in her life, softened in ways that no one expected. He had always been the protector of the family, the strong arm of their household. But seeing his daughter in such a fragile state, his heart broke for her. He had been a man of few words, but now he became the listener, the silent support who never left her side. He knew that healing wasn't just about medical treatment. It was about the strength of the people surrounding her. The unconditional love of her family became Rebecca's foundation, even if it was hard for her to fully accept it in those early stages. Though Rebecca's recovery was progressing, the psychological toll of her ordeal was never far from her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, She could hear the echoes of the voices of her captors, the harsh words they had used to control her. She could still feel the weight of the chains they had placed on her wrists, the suffocating grip of isolation. Every sound, every movement, seemed to trigger memories of her time in captivity. The nightmares were relentless, and she would wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for air as if she had been suffocating in her sleep. In these moments, she had to remind herself that she was safe now, that she was no longer bound by the chains of fear. But the journey wasn't as simple as just telling herself that. Healing wasn't a linear process. It was a battle that would take place inside her mind for years to come. Outside the safety of her home, Des Moines was beginning to heal too. The news coverage of Rebecca's rescue had brought a sense of closure to the community. People who had once been filled with uncertainty now had something to hold on to. A symbol of hope, a story of survival. It wasn't easy for the community to accept the truth of what had been happening in their midst, but they took comfort in the fact that the authorities had dismantled a dangerous criminal operation, one that had affected so many lives. Yet, even as Des Moines moved forward, questions remained. The authorities continued to piece together the intricate web of Brian's criminal network, which extended far beyond the confines of the city. The investigation, though seemingly concluded with Brian's arrest and the dismantling of the operation, was far from over. There were still other members of the network out there, hiding in the shadows, and the police knew that it was only a matter of time before they would have to confront the full extent of what had been happening under their noses. Rebecca's testimony played a crucial role in helping to expose the entire operation. In the weeks following her rescue, she met with detectives and law enforcement officials, recounting everything she could remember about the people who had held her captive. It was painful for her, but she knew that her willingness to share the details of her captivity was essential in bringing those responsible to justice. Some of the names she recalled were familiar to the authorities, but there were others whose involvement in the criminal network had gone unnoticed until now. The investigation revealed that Brian had been just one cog in a much larger machine, a machine that spanned across state lines and involved trafficking rings that extended deep into the heart of the country. The full scale of the operation was chilling, and as the pieces fell into place, the police realized just how close they had come to losing Rebecca forever. But even as the police worked to track down the remaining members of the network, there was a deeper, more unsettling truth that began to emerge. Rebecca's captors weren't just criminals. They were part of a larger underworld, one that profited from the misery of others. The trafficking ring they had been a part of was just the tip of the iceberg, a small piece of a much darker puzzle. For Rebecca's family, the emotional aftermath of the ordeal was just beginning. Her parents had been through the worst possible nightmare and had emerged on the other side, but the weight of what had happened to their daughter was something they would carry with them forever. There were times when they struggled to understand what their daughter had gone through, times when they found it difficult to speak of it without the painful lump in their throats. But they continued to support Rebecca, never wavering in their belief that she would overcome whatever demons haunted her. Rebecca herself faced the daunting task of rebuilding her life. She had spent months recovering physically, and now she faced the even harder work of healing her mind and spirit. Each day was a small victory, a step closer to the woman she used to be, but she knew that she would never be the same. The girl who had gone missing months ago was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had faced unspeakable horrors and had survived. But as she sat with her family on quiet evenings, talking about the future, she realized that she could still find peace. She could still create a life that was meaningful and filled with love. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be the life she had envisioned before all of this, but it was hers. And that, she realized, was enough. The world outside may never understand the full extent of her suffering, but Rebecca had come to understand something important. The journey of healing was a solitary one, but it was also a journey that required the support of those around her. And she had that in abundance. Her parents, her friends, and her community, each of them played a role in her recovery. But it was Rebecca's own resilience, her own courage in the face of unfathomable pain, that would ultimately define her. She was not the sum of the terrible things that had been done to her. She was more than that. She was a survivor, and she would not be defined by her past. Rebecca had found her strength again, not by denying what had happened to her, but by accepting it, confronting it, and choosing to move forward. Rebecca's journey was far from linear. The healing process, which had started with an almost imperceptible step, now moved at a pace that both exhausted and rejuvenated her. She'd found solace in the routine, in the small things, the sunrise that warmed the sky each morning, the cup of tea that seemed to calm her nerves, the gentle rhythm of her own breath as she practiced meditation. These were the anchors that kept her grounded as she navigated the murky waters of her recovery. As the months wore on, Rebecca began to return to the life she had once known, although it was different in ways that were impossible to ignore. The girl who had once been carefree, full of optimism and vitality, was no longer the same. She had learned things about herself she had never wanted to know, faced fears she had never imagined would come to pass. But in the face of it all, she found strength. A strength that, while forged in the fire of her trauma, would guide her in ways she had not expected. Her parents remained her unwavering support system. They understood, even without needing to speak, that Rebecca's recovery wasn't something they could rush. The simple act of showing up, of being there for her in silence, of holding her hand when the darkness seemed too much to bear, was enough. Slowly over time, the walls that had been erected between them, built by the fear, pain, and confusion of Rebecca's ordeal, began to crumble. Rebecca, however, struggled with one thing above all: forgiveness. Forgiveness of herself. She knew that the horrors she had faced weren't her fault, but that didn't erase the feelings of guilt that lingered deep inside her. There were moments when she thought, could I have done something differently? Could I have escaped sooner? Could I have fought harder? These questions gnawed at her, gnashing away at the edges of her peace. It wasn't until she began seeing a therapist specializing in trauma recovery that she learned to confront these feelings, one by one. She realized that it was not weakness to ask these questions, it was part of the healing process. And in time, she would learn to forgive herself. Meanwhile, the authorities continued to pursue the remnants of the criminal network that had taken so much from Rebecca and others like her. The investigation expanded, and it became clear just how far-reaching Brian's operations had been. But despite their best efforts, law enforcement found that many of those involved had already slipped into the shadows. They had disappeared, leaving only a trail of destruction in their wake. While the case was technically closed, the underworld Brian had been a part of remained a mystery, a haunting specter that loomed over Rebecca's life. Even though Rebecca's role in exposing the network had been pivotal, she found herself wrestling with the aftermath. The police, though grateful for her bravery in coming forward, had inadvertently placed her in the spotlight once again. Her name was now known, not just locally but nationally, and the attention was something she had never asked for. She longed for peace, for a return to the anonymity she had once taken for granted. Yet, in a way, the attention was a small price to pay for the fact that she was alive, that she had escaped. As Rebecca slowly returned to her life, she discovered a new sense of purpose. It wasn't about the things she had lost, but rather about rebuilding what she could. She found herself drawn to working with others who had faced similar horrors, individuals who had suffered from trafficking and other forms of abuse. She became involved in several organizations that offered support to survivors, using her own story as a means to help others find their way to healing. Her work was not easy. It was emotionally taxing, draining, and at times it felt like she was reopening old wounds. But it also provided her with something that she had longed for, a sense of empowerment. In helping others, Rebecca found a way to reclaim control over her life, to turn the pain of her past into something meaningful. It was during one of these sessions, when she was speaking to a group of survivors, that she first realized the extent of her own transformation. The people in the room were all at different stages of their recovery, and Rebecca found herself offering words of wisdom and strength that she hadn't known she had. She talked about the importance of self-compassion, about learning to be gentle with oneself in the face of overwhelming adversity. And in that moment, Rebecca understood something profound, that the journey of healing wasn't just about getting back to who she had been before. It was about becoming someone stronger, someone who could help others navigate their own journeys. The ripple effect of Rebecca's work extended beyond the survivors she helped. It touched the lives of the people who supported her, those who had witnessed her transformation and growth. Her parents, who had been her rock, now saw her not just as their daughter, but as a force of nature in her own right. They were proud of the woman she was becoming, even if they could never fully comprehend the depths of her suffering. They had seen the scars, both physical and emotional, but they also saw the incredible resilience she had cultivated. As the years passed, Rebecca's life slowly took on a new rhythm. She found joy in simple things again, the rustling of the leaves in the fall breeze, the sound of laughter with friends, the quiet moments spent curled up with a book. She didn't forget what had happened to her, but she had learned to live alongside it. The darkness no longer defined her, it was simply a part of her story. And then, one day, as Rebecca sat on her porch watching the sunset, she thought back to the girl she had been before all of this. That girl was gone, but the woman she had become was stronger, wiser, and far more compassionate. She had faced the unimaginable and had come out the other side, not unscathed, but transformed. In the quiet of that evening, with the sky painted in hues of orange and pink, Rebecca smiled. She had made it. Against all odds, she had survived. And in doing so, she had found the greatest gift of all, the ability to move forward. Case 3. In the small city of Kelowna, nestled in British Columbia, Canada, a case unfolded in the late spring of 2012 that would forever change the lives of its residents. At the heart of this story was a man named Michael Travers, a 34-year-old with a criminal past that had remained largely hidden from the public eye. Michael had spent most of his life in and out of trouble, but he had managed to fly under the radar for many years. However, everything was about to change. Michael's past was not one that could be easily overlooked. Born and raised in Kelowna, he had a tumultuous upbringing. His father had been absent for most of his childhood, and his mother struggled with addiction. Michael was forced to fend for himself from a young age, and his life took a turn toward crime as he grew older. By the time he was in his late 20s, Michael had been involved in petty theft, drug distribution, and even a few violent altercations. His record, though not extensive, was enough to catch the attention of law enforcement on occasion. However, despite his criminal background, Michael had always managed to keep a low profile. He was intelligent, calculating, and knew how to avoid detection. It wasn't until 2012 that his true nature would be revealed, not through his usual petty crimes, but through something much darker and more calculated. It started on a quiet evening in May. The city was experiencing the early warmth of summer, and Kelowna's streets were alive with the hustle and bustle of people enjoying the changing weather. As dusk fell, a woman named Laura Thomas, a well-known real estate agent in the city, was finishing up a long day at work. She was walking to her car when she noticed something odd, a shadow moving just beyond her line of sight. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to make her uneasy. Laura dismissed it at first, telling herself that it was just the anxiety of a long day getting the best of her. But as she drove home that evening, something didn't feel right. The streets seemed quieter than usual, and there was an odd tension in the air. The following morning, the unease turned into something far more tangible. News reports started flooding in about an unsettling event. Laura was one of several victims of a series of break-ins that had taken place overnight. The thief had broken into several homes in the upscale neighborhoods surrounding Kelowna, stealing valuables and leaving behind minimal traces of evidence. The police were called in, but the scene left little for investigators to work with. At first, the case seemed like just another string of robberies, a common occurrence in the city. But as the days passed, it became clear that something more sinister was at play. The break-ins were carefully orchestrated, with the thief seeming to know exactly when and where to strike. It wasn't just about stealing for financial gain. There was a deeper, more unsettling motivation behind the crimes. As the investigation unfolded, Michael Travers' name began to surface. Law enforcement discovered that he had recently been seen in several of the areas where the break-ins had occurred, and witnesses reported seeing him acting suspiciously around the time of the incidents. Michael had been living on the fringes of society, working odd jobs, and avoiding any attention from the authorities. But with the break-ins, his presence was becoming impossible to ignore. Detective Sarah Bennett, a seasoned investigator with the Kelowna Police Department, was assigned to the case. She quickly realized that this wasn't an ordinary thief. There was something more deliberate about these crimes, something that suggested a deeper psychological motivation. The break-ins were not just about taking material goods, they were about sending a message. Sarah's first breakthrough came when she interviewed a neighbor who had witnessed Michael in the area shortly before one of the robberies. The neighbor, an older woman named Evelyn, described Michael as someone who blended into the background, never drawing attention to himself. He was someone who could easily slip into a crowd without anyone noticing. Evelyn's statement provided the first real lead in the case. But it wasn't just the break-ins that made Michael a person of interest. As Detective Bennett dug deeper into his past, she uncovered a history of disturbing behavior. Michael had been involved in several altercations over the years, each one more violent than the last. There were whispers of darker tendencies, of a man who had always been just a step away from completely losing control. Sarah's instincts told her that Michael was capable of far more than just petty theft. As the investigation continued, the pattern of Michael's crimes began to take shape. He wasn't just stealing valuables, he was stealing something far more precious: privacy, security, and peace of mind. The way he stalked his victims, the way he chose when and where to strike, suggested a level of premeditation and planning that went far beyond simple theft. One by one, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Michael had been carefully planning these break-ins for months, studying the habits of his victims, learning their routines, and striking when they were most vulnerable. It was as if he was performing a twisted form of voyeurism, taking pleasure in the invasion of their personal spaces. By mid-June, Detective Bennett was confident that Michael was the perpetrator. But what troubled her was the lack of a clear motive. Why had he chosen this particular target? Why had he escalated his crimes in such a manner? The answers, it seemed, lay in the darkness of Michael's mind. As the story of the Kelowna criminal case began to unravel, the residents of the city were left in shock. They had always known that crime existed, but they never imagined that someone like Michael Travers, someone who had lived among them for so long, could be capable of such calculated and disturbing actions. The case would forever leave its mark on the city, not just because of the crimes themselves, but because it revealed the darkness lurking just beneath the surface of a seemingly quiet community. The investigation into Michael Travers grew more intense as Detective Sarah Bennett and her team pieced together the disturbing patterns of his actions. As the days passed, they realized that they weren't just dealing with a common thief. Michael's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, and there was a sinister undertone to his actions that left a chilling effect on those who were involved in the case. The more Sarah delved into Michael's past, the more she discovered the twisted psychological profile that made him the perfect predator. His childhood, marked by neglect and the absence of a father figure, had shaped him into someone who lacked empathy and connection. Raised in a volatile environment, Michael never had the opportunity to develop healthy emotional bonds. His mother's struggle with addiction had created an unstable home life, and he had learned to fend for himself in a world that seemed to offer him little. By his late teens, Michael had fallen into a pattern of petty crime. Stealing from local stores, vandalizing properties, and getting into physical altercations were just some of the ways he acted out. There was always a sense of alienation, of being on the outside looking in, as though the world didn't quite make sense to him. But as he grew older, his criminal tendencies deepened. Petty theft turned into more serious offenses. Small-time drug dealing became his primary source of income. He was never the type to take risks without carefully planning his next move, and he had managed to stay under the radar for years. Sarah had already been in law enforcement long enough to recognize the signs of a serial criminal. Michael's escalating behavior was something that couldn't be ignored. The break-ins had been a clear sign that his need for control, for power, was growing. It wasn't just about taking material possessions. It was about invading the sanctity of his victims' homes, their private lives. He wasn't content with simple robbery. He needed to make a statement. As the investigation progressed, Detective Bennett began to understand the complexity of the case. The break-ins Michael had committed were methodical, almost surgical. He didn't simply barge into a home and take whatever he could find. No, he planned each burglary meticulously. He studied his victims, learned their habits, and identified their weaknesses. In some cases, he waited for weeks before making his move. His knowledge of the city and its residents allowed him to move undetected, slipping in and out of homes without leaving any trace of his presence. The victims in the Kelowna case were all from well-off backgrounds. They were professionals, business owners, and people who had worked hard to build comfortable lives for themselves and their families. But Michael wasn't targeting them for their wealth alone. He targeted them because they represented something he felt he could never attain: security, stability, a life without fear. For Michael, the break-ins were a twisted form of revenge, a way to take from those who had what he couldn't seem to achieve. But as Sarah's investigation revealed, Michael's crimes were not just about stealing valuables. They were about asserting dominance. Each burglary seemed to be a challenge, an attempt to outsmart the police and prove his superiority. He was leaving clues, almost taunting investigators, as if daring them to catch him. There were moments when Michael seemed to be almost playing a game, reveling in the chaos he had caused. The case took another disturbing turn when Michael's name began to surface in connection with the disappearance of a local woman. Her name was Allison Green, a single mother who had recently moved to Kelowna to start a new life. She had been reported missing a few days after one of Michael's break-ins, and while there was no direct evidence linking him to her disappearance, Sarah couldn't ignore the possibility. The timing of her vanishing coincided with one of Michael's crimes, and the eerie similarities between her case and the pattern of his break-ins raised suspicion. Allison's disappearance added a new layer of urgency to the investigation. What had started as a string of robberies now seemed to be evolving into something far more serious. The possibility that Michael had escalated from theft to kidnapping was a chilling thought. Sarah knew that she had to move quickly before things took an even darker turn. Detective Bennett, along with her team, began to track down every lead they could find. They spoke to witnesses, reviewed security footage, and canvassed neighborhoods. They even went so far as to interview Michael's old acquaintances, hoping to learn more about his behavior and potential motives. It became clear that Michael had a history of avoiding detection. He was careful, methodical, and always one step ahead of the authorities. But Sarah wasn't about to give up. She knew that they were close to uncovering the truth, and that truth, as disturbing as it was, had to come to light. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure mounted. The residents of Kelowna, once confident in the safety of their city, were now gripped with fear. The case had become a topic of constant conversation in the community. People began to lock their doors at night, their sense of security shattered by the knowledge that someone in their midst was capable of such calculated cruelty. Michael, however, seemed to be slipping further into the shadows. It was as though he knew that the walls were closing in on him, but he had no intention of being caught. He continued his life as if nothing had changed, his daily routines unaffected by the growing investigation. It was as though the hunt itself fueled him, giving him a sense of purpose and excitement. But Sarah wasn't going to let him get away. As she reviewed the case files late one night, she made a breakthrough. She had noticed a small detail that had gone unnoticed by others, a pattern in Michael's behavior that was hiding in plain sight. The way he targeted certain neighborhoods, the way he left subtle clues at each crime scene, it all pointed to one thing. Michael was a man obsessed with control, and he needed to feel like he was the one in charge. This realization sent Sarah on a new trajectory. Instead of focusing solely on the physical evidence, she began to examine Michael's psychological profile more closely. She realized that the key to understanding his next move lay in his need for dominance, and if she could predict where he would strike next, they could finally catch him. As she and her team prepared for their next move, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Michael was watching them. His presence was like a shadow, looming just out of reach. But Sarah was determined to end the terror that had gripped Kelowna. She knew that Michael had to be stopped before he could do any more harm. The next few days were crucial. Detective Bennett and her team carefully planned their approach, studying Michael's patterns, his habits, and his weaknesses. They knew they were close, but as the investigation unfolded, they began to understand that catching Michael wasn't just about putting together the physical evidence. It was about getting inside his mind, understanding the darkness that drove him to commit such heinous acts. Michael Travers was not just a criminal. He was a man driven by a deep, unsettling need to feel in control. And as Sarah prepared for the final confrontation, she knew that she was about to face a man who would stop at nothing to avoid capture. The city of Kelowna had already been shaken to its core, but the real nightmare had only just begun. As Detective Sarah Bennett and her team gathered their information, each moment seemed to stretch on endlessly. They were close, but Michael Travers was a ghost, slipping through their grasp every time they thought they had him cornered. It wasn't just his cunning or the meticulousness of his planning. It was the way he had learned to manipulate his environment, to make himself invisible when it mattered most. The more Sarah looked at his history, the more it became apparent that Michael didn't just commit crimes, he lived within them. Crime was his art, and every act was a carefully crafted stroke on a dark canvas of control. The investigation had become a race against time. The longer Michael remained free, the more unpredictable his behavior became. Sarah could feel it in her gut, the unease, the tightening in her chest whenever she thought about Allison Green's disappearance. The chilling possibility that Michael was responsible haunted her thoughts. What had happened to her? Was she still alive? The questions gnawed at her, and with each passing day, they pushed her forward, urging her to find him. The pressure was mounting on Sarah and her team. The case had become a source of public obsession. News outlets were covering every detail, speculating on the motives behind Michael's crimes, painting him as a cold, calculating predator. In Kelowna, the normally peaceful town had become a place of fear. People were scared to leave their homes, unsure of whether they would return to find their lives torn apart. The paranoia seeped into every conversation, every glance shared between neighbors. The very streets that had once been familiar and safe now seemed foreign, tinged with uncertainty. At the local precinct, Detective Bennett sat late into the night, reviewing everything they had gathered on Michael. She was no longer just looking at his crimes. She was trying to see the man behind them, trying to understand his mind. His actions didn't follow a predictable pattern of a common criminal. It was more like he was playing a game, a dangerous, high-stakes game where the prize wasn't money or material wealth, but something far more elusive: control, dominance, and a warped sense of justice. As Sarah pieced together his history, it became evident that Michael had always been a loner. His relationships were strained, often non-existent. He never kept friends for long, often distancing himself from people who tried to get close. His childhood had left deep scars, and the absence of a father figure in his life had molded him into someone who trusted no one. His mother, unable to care for him properly, had left him to fend for himself. She had battled her own demons, and as a result, Michael had been forced to grow up quickly, adapting to an environment where survival was the only goal. The more Sarah learned about Michael's background, the more she understood his need to control. His upbringing had been a crucible, forging him into someone who sought power in the most unsettling of ways. It wasn't just about money or possessions. It was about stripping away the illusion of safety, of breaking into the lives of his victims, and proving that no one was untouchable. He wasn't just stealing objects, he was stealing the very essence of their security. Michael's crime spree wasn't confined to mere theft. It had become a sick form of self-validation. He wasn't trying to get rich. He was trying to prove something to himself. Each break-in, each burglary, was a statement, a declaration that he could invade the most sacred parts of others' lives and leave without a trace. It was as if the more elaborate his plans became, the more significant they were to him. His ego was entwined with his ability to outsmart law enforcement, to remain a step ahead in this twisted game of cat and mouse. It was when Sarah and her team began to focus more on Michael's patterns that they discovered a disturbing connection between the locations of his break-ins and the places where Allison Green had been seen before her disappearance. The subtle overlap was undeniable. Sarah's intuition told her that this wasn't a coincidence. Allison's disappearance had to be linked to Michael in some way. The question now was whether he had taken her willingly, or if something far darker had unfolded. In the days following, Sarah focused all of her efforts on trying to establish a direct connection between Michael and Allison's case. She began reviewing all of the surveillance footage available from the neighborhoods where Michael had struck and where Allison had been last seen. It was then that she uncovered something shocking. Footage from a nearby convenience store showed a man, whose profile resembled Michael's, walking in the same direction as Allison just hours before she vanished. He was alone, and he was moving deliberately, like a predator closing in on its prey. This discovery was a turning point in the investigation. With the new evidence, the team was able to corroborate their suspicion that Michael had been involved in Allison's disappearance. But the problem was that they still didn't know where he had taken her, or even if she was still alive. The uncertainty hung over Sarah like a cloud, casting a shadow over every decision she made. The following days were filled with a frantic search. Detective Bennett worked tirelessly, following every lead and speaking with anyone who might know Michael's whereabouts. But as they closed in, Michael seemed to vanish completely, slipping through their grasp once again. His movements were erratic but deliberate. He knew how to cover his tracks, and his deep understanding of the city gave him an edge. He had planned for every eventuality, anticipating the police's moves and always staying a step ahead. The investigation soon reached a breaking point. Sarah felt as though she was running in circles, chasing ghosts. Every time they thought they had a lead, it dissipated into nothing. But just when she thought they were at a standstill, a new breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A local resident had come forward with a tip. She had seen something strange the night Allison had disappeared. The woman lived in a house near the area where Allison was last seen, and while walking her dog, she had noticed a dark vehicle parked on a secluded road. It wasn't unusual for cars to park there, but this one caught her attention because it had been there for hours, with no movement. The woman had also reported seeing a man walking away from the vehicle that night, carrying something that appeared to be a bundle. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it, but after seeing the news about Allison's disappearance, she felt compelled to speak up. This new information led Sarah and her team to a stretch of land outside of Kelowna, a quiet area on the outskirts of town. It was a place that Michael had likely chosen for its isolation, knowing that it would give him the perfect cover. As the investigation team gathered their resources, they made the decision to search the area. The hours passed slowly as they combed through the dense forest and abandoned buildings that dotted the landscape. They had no idea what they would find, but they had to act quickly. Time was running out. The sense of anticipation was unbearable. Every sound in the darkened forest seemed amplified, every shadow appearing suspicious. Sarah's heart raced as she moved through the woods, her flashlight casting long, eerie beams across the terrain. Her mind raced with questions, fears, and doubts. What had Michael done to Allison? Was she still alive? Was this the end of the line for the investigation, or were they about to uncover something far worse than they had imagined? The deeper they went, the more the sense of unease grew. The silence was broken only by the crunch of footsteps on the forest floor and the occasional call of an owl. But as they reached the end of the path, something caught Sarah's eye, an old, abandoned cabin, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the land. It was an eerie sight, one that seemed out of place amidst the overgrown trees and the stillness of the night. With no time to waste, Sarah motioned for her team to approach cautiously. They crept up to the cabin, their senses on high alert. The door was ajar, as if inviting them inside. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest as she pushed it open, revealing the dark interior. It was empty, except for the faint smell of decay that filled the air. The furniture was old, covered in dust, and there was no sign of a struggle. But as Sarah's eyes scanned the room, she froze. Something was wrong. On the floor, partially hidden beneath a torn rug, was a blood-stained piece of cloth. It was small, inconspicuous, but it sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The scene felt wrong, ominously wrong. As the team searched the cabin, they found more disturbing evidence. A stack of papers, crumpled and torn, contained cryptic notes and diagrams, plans that seemed to outline Michael's actions, detailing his crimes and his next moves. It was as if he had been meticulously documenting everything, leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs for the investigators to follow. The discovery in the cabin would change everything. Michael had been here. He had left his mark, and the investigation was about to take a dark turn. Detective Sarah Bennett stood still, her eyes fixed on the room. The piece of blood-stained cloth felt like a weight, a symbol of everything they had yet to uncover. The cabin, with its dilapidated furniture and unsettling atmosphere, seemed like the perfect hideaway for someone like Michael Travers. It was isolated, far from the reach of the watchful eyes of the city, and it was a place where the shadows could conceal all manner of horrors. As her team continued to search the cabin, Sarah's thoughts raced. She could feel her pulse quickening as she began to piece together the significance of what they had found. Michael wasn't just a criminal, he was meticulous, obsessive even. His mind worked in patterns that others couldn't begin to comprehend, and this cabin, with its cryptic notes and hidden messages, was the reflection of that twisted genius. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing at the edge of something much darker than they had ever imagined. The room felt like a tomb, each corner steeped in the weight of secrets. Sarah walked slowly toward the scattered papers, her flashlight illuminating the yellowed pages as she picked them up one by one. The diagrams were unsettling, maps of Kelowna, with certain locations circled in red, many of them aligned with places Michael had previously targeted. But there was something new, something different this time. There were additional markings, new routes he'd mapped out, and dates. The calendar pages were covered in meticulous, handwritten notes, and the patterns began to form a chilling picture. It was a timeline, a countdown. Michael had been planning something big, something far beyond the small-time burglaries that had originally defined his criminal career. As Sarah scanned the notes, she saw references to Allison Green. She hadn't been the first to catch his eye. There were other names, others who had crossed his path, each one marked with the same chilling precision. This was more than a string of robberies. This was something methodical, something far more sinister. The revelation hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. Allison Green hadn't been a random victim. She had been a target, just like the others. But why? What had Michael been planning? And more importantly, where was Allison now? The thought that she could still be out there, caught in Michael's web, made Sarah's heart race. It was as if the truth was always within reach, but no matter how close they got, it was always just beyond their grasp. The rest of the team continued to scour the cabin, finding more clues, but nothing that could give them a clear answer to the one question that plagued them all. Where was Allison? It was almost as if Michael had been preparing for something catastrophic, as though his twisted game had reached its final stage. And now, Sarah felt the weight of that realization settling heavily on her shoulders. With the information they had gathered from the cabin, Sarah ordered a full forensic sweep of the area. Everything needed to be documented, every detail analyzed. But even as they worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led down a rabbit hole, deeper into a darkness that Michael had carefully cultivated. The more they uncovered, the more questions they had, and the less they seemed to understand. Hours passed in a blur of investigation, but Sarah didn't leave the cabin. Her team worked diligently to gather evidence, but Sarah couldn't stop thinking about what they had found. The more she thought about it, the more she realized just how little they truly understood about Michael Travers. He wasn't just a man who committed crimes for the sake of money or thrill. He was a man who sought control, who reveled in the destruction of others' lives. The depth of his manipulation, his ability to weave chaos into every moment, was something far beyond what they had encountered before. As the team packed up and prepared to leave the cabin, Sarah couldn't help but feel that they were missing something crucial, something that would tie everything together. The pieces of the puzzle were all there, but they didn't fit, not yet. Michael was a master at playing the long game, and they were simply following the trail he had left behind, like pawns in a much larger plan. When Sarah returned to the precinct, she sat at her desk, staring at the evidence in front of her. The walls seemed to close in around her, the weight of the investigation pressing on her chest. There was no easy way out of this. They had to find Michael, and they had to do it soon. Every second that passed was another second where he could be out there, slipping further into the shadows. As she sifted through the papers, something caught her eye, an innocuous detail she hadn't noticed before. It was a series of cryptic symbols on one of Michael's maps, markings that didn't seem to make sense at first. They were scattered across different locations in Kelowna, each symbol appearing multiple times, almost as if Michael had been following a hidden pattern. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to make sense of it. It wasn't until she compared the symbols to the locations on the map that it clicked. Michael wasn't just picking targets at random. These weren't just places he had broken into in the past. They were places he had planned to return to. But why? And what was the significance of these symbols? They didn't match anything they had encountered so far. Suddenly, Sarah remembered something from the early days of the investigation. A small detail that hadn't seemed important at the time, but now it seemed to fit. A local artist had reported seeing a man sketching in the park several weeks before Allison had gone missing. The artist had mentioned that the man had been fixated on the symbols, drawing them obsessively in his sketchbook. The memory came back to Sarah in a rush. The man had described the drawings as intricate, almost like a code. The connection hit Sarah like a lightning bolt. The symbols weren't just random. They were part of something larger, something Michael had been working on for a long time. He was creating a blueprint, a map that led to something far more significant than they had realized. And Allison was at the center of it. With this new lead, Sarah called her team together. They needed to follow the symbols, track down the artist, and uncover what Michael had been planning. Every step of the investigation had been leading them to this point, and now Sarah could feel it. The walls were closing in on Michael. They just had to piece it all together before it was too late. As the team set out to follow up on the new lead, Sarah's mind raced with the implications of what they had uncovered. Michael Travers wasn't just a burglar. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a mastermind, a manipulator who had orchestrated a series of events to lead them to this moment. And now they had to outsmart him before he outsmarted them. The journey was far from over. But for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. They were getting closer. The pieces were starting to fit. And with each new clue, they were one step closer to finding Allison, one step closer to bringing Michael Travers to justice. But as they followed the trail of symbols through the city, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, one that Michael had set for them from the very beginning. And the closer they got to him, the more dangerous the game would become. Every moment, every second was critical. The clock was ticking, and the stakes had never been higher. The team had no choice but to keep pushing forward. They had to find Michael. They had to find Allison. And they had to do it before the final act of this twisted game was played. Detective Sarah Bennett's footsteps echoed softly in the quiet hallway of the precinct. She had been with the Kelowna Police Department for over a decade, yet every case still carried the weight of something new, something that challenged her. The latest case had already begun to shape up as something far more complicated than she had initially anticipated. There were no simple answers, and every lead seemed to open more questions than it closed. It all started with a series of mysterious disappearances, starting with Allison Green. Allison was a young woman, just 27, and no one could understand why she had vanished. She had no apparent enemies, no dark secrets, and her social circle was tight-knit. Everything seemed normal, almost too perfect, and then she was gone. A missing persons report was filed, but the case quickly escalated when a second woman disappeared. And then a third. They all had one thing in common: no trace. No ransom notes, no signs of forced entry, nothing. It was as if they had simply evaporated into thin air. As the weeks passed, Sarah's frustration grew. There were no witnesses, no CCTV footage to offer clues. The only thing that tied the cases together were the cryptic symbols found at each of the locations. They weren't drawn, nor were they written with ink. They were carved into surfaces, wood, stone, even dirt. The symbols didn't seem to belong to any known language, and they were unlike anything Sarah had ever encountered. It wasn't until Sarah and her team discovered an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of Kelowna that the case began to take a more tangible form. The house had been empty for years, according to local records. However, the inside told a different story. The front door was ajar, and the air inside was stale, heavy with dust. The rooms were dark, illuminated only by the dim beam of their flashlights. There was an eerie silence that filled the house, as if it were holding its breath. One of the officers, Detective Jordan Scott, was the first to spot the symbol etched into the wall. It was in a small room at the back of the house. At first glance, it appeared to be a random collection of lines and shapes, but as they studied it more closely, something about it felt deliberate, organized. It wasn't a random act of vandalism. This was purposeful. "This has to be related," Jordan muttered, running his fingers over the etched lines. "This is too similar to the symbols we found at the other scenes." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. If this was connected, it was no coincidence. But what did it mean? Who had been here? And why this house? They continued their search, moving through the rooms methodically. As they approached the kitchen, they noticed something strange. A large wooden table was covered in papers, maps, and photographs. It was a haphazard collection, as if someone had been preparing for something, a plan perhaps, but what? The photographs on the table were all of the missing women. Allison Green was front and center, but the others were there too. Sarah picked up one of the photos, her fingers brushing the edges. It was a close-up shot of a woman she didn't recognize, but the expression on her face struck her. Intense, almost as if she knew something terrible was about to happen. "It's a map," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper as she spread the papers across the table. There, drawn on a large piece of butcher paper, was a map of Kelowna. At least, it looked like a map. It was covered with the same symbols, scattered in various locations across the city. "This isn't just about the women," Sarah continued. "It's about control. Whoever did this is trying to manipulate something, some kind of pattern." Jordan leaned over, trying to make sense of it. But why the symbols? Why these specific locations? Sarah took a step back, the pieces slowly beginning to fall into place. She had worked with her fair share of criminals, but this case felt different. Whoever was behind these disappearances wasn't just a run-of-the-mill criminal. No, this person was methodical, calculating. And they were sending a message that was getting more complicated by the minute. As Sarah stared at the map, a flash of realization hit her. One of the locations on the map was not far from where they had found the body of the first victim. The others were scattered around the city, but one stood out, an abandoned building just outside the city limits. The place had been derelict for years, but it was a place that Sarah knew all too well. "That's it," she said, her voice firm. "This is where it's all leading. We need to get there now." The team packed up quickly, preparing to head out to the site. There was no time to waste. Every moment they delayed could cost them the breakthrough they so desperately needed. As they drove to the location, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were about to walk into something far darker than they had anticipated. The symbols, the photographs, the map, it all pointed to one thing. Whoever had orchestrated this was ready for them to come. The building was surrounded by dense trees, the kind of place where no one would ever think to look. It was quiet, too quiet, as if it had been waiting for them. Sarah's hand rested on the handle of her gun as they approached. The team fanned out, moving cautiously through the overgrown yard. When they reached the front door, it was wide open, as if someone had been expecting them. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just a house, it was a stage, and they were the players. The inside was dark, the air thick with the smell of mildew. They moved carefully, checking each room, each corner, each shadow. Then they found it, the basement. Descending into the darkness, Sarah's flashlight revealed a room unlike any she had ever seen. The walls were covered in more symbols, the same strange carvings that had been found at every location. There were rows of photographs pinned to the wall, each one of a different woman, each one with the same haunting expression. And in the center of the room, there was a chair. A single chair, sitting alone in the middle of the room, surrounded by more of the same symbols. On the floor beneath the chair, something was written in what looked like chalk. It was a phrase, a message. "Your time is almost up." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was it. They had found the final piece. The missing women were part of something much larger, a game. And they were the next targets. The message wasn't just for them, it was a warning. The team scrambled to take in the scene, photographing everything, taking notes, trying to make sense of the room. But Sarah could barely focus. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't just about finding the women anymore. It was about stopping whoever was behind this, before it was too late. The basement was eerily quiet, the silence hanging like a heavy curtain in the air. Sarah's breath seemed louder than usual as she took in the cryptic message scrawled beneath the chair. The chalk markings, though faint, still seemed to burn into her mind. The words were clear. "Your time is almost up." Her pulse quickened. It was clear now. This wasn't just about the women who had disappeared. This was a deliberate game, a twisted series of moves and counter-moves, with the lives of the victims dangling precariously in the balance. "Get everyone down here," she whispered to Jordan, who had been by her side since the beginning of this investigation. He nodded, turning to the others, and soon the room was filled with the rest of the team, their footsteps echoing in the space, their flashlights dancing off the walls, illuminating the grotesque symbols that marked every surface. Detective Bennett's mind raced as she reviewed the events in her head. The map, the symbols, the photographs, everything was connected. It was only a matter of time before they connected the dots and figured out who was behind all of this. But something still gnawed at her, a lingering sense that they were missing something important, something key to the puzzle. "Sarah," Jordan said softly, drawing her out of her thoughts. "What do we do now?" Her eyes flicked to the symbols, to the chalk writing. "We need to get back to the city, look through everything again. We missed something, there's something more to this." Her voice was steady, but inside, her gut twisted. Time was running out, and whoever was behind this was still one step ahead. The drive back to the precinct felt like a blur. The team worked tirelessly, revisiting every lead, re-examining every piece of evidence. They found nothing new at first, just the same symbols repeated in different places. But it was then that something hit Sarah. A faint memory surfaced, a report she had seen early in the investigation. It was about a local man who had once been part of a small, obscure religious cult that had disbanded years ago. The name was James Fletcher. The cult had once been known for its extreme, secretive practices, often marked by strange rituals and cryptic symbols. Sarah recalled that the cult had been investigated for several years before it was broken up. Most of its members had disappeared into the background of society, their whereabouts unknown. Fletcher, however, had been one of the more vocal members before they were disbanded. He had always been a quiet presence, but the lingering memory of his name was enough to cause a spark of recognition. "Fletcher," Sarah murmured aloud, her eyes narrowing in thought. He could be the link. The more they dug into Fletcher's past, the clearer the picture became. He had been quiet for years, blending into society, a nondescript man with no criminal record to speak of. But there were rumors, whispers of strange gatherings in the woods, and reports of people going missing years ago, back when the cult was active. Could it be that Fletcher had never truly left the life he had known? That perhaps he had started his own twisted version of it in secret, with the ultimate goal of building his own dark following? With the new information, Sarah made the call. They needed to find Fletcher and bring him in before he could do any more harm. The search didn't take long. After a few hours of combing through public records and reaching out to old acquaintances, they found him living in a small, unassuming house on the edge of town, far enough away that no one would have thought twice about it. When they arrived, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The house was exactly what she had imagined, a broken-down structure, hidden behind tall trees and thick foliage. It was eerily quiet. No lights in the windows, no sign of life. The team moved quickly but cautiously. They approached the house from all sides, ready for whatever they might find inside. They weren't sure what to expect, but the stakes were high. If Fletcher was indeed the one responsible for the disappearances, this was their only chance to stop him. The front door was locked, but with a quick motion, Jordan forced it open. The smell of mildew and decay greeted them as they stepped inside. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, as if the house had been trapped in time. As they moved through the rooms, they were met with more of the same. Symbols carved into the walls, photographs pinned up in chaotic arrays, and strange drawings scattered across the floor. But then, in the center of the living room, they found something different. It was a large wooden box, the kind that you would expect to find in an old attic, covered in dust and cobwebs. Sarah motioned for the others to stay back as she slowly approached it. There was a strange aura around the box, as though it were holding some dark secret. With a deep breath, she opened the box. Inside were the missing women. Not in the physical sense, of course, but their faces. Dozens of photographs, recent ones, were stacked inside. It was a sickening collection of trophies, each one meticulously arranged. Some of the women had been captured in public places, others in their homes. They were all smiling, unaware of the danger they were in. But there was one face that stood out to Sarah. It was Allison Green. She had been the first to disappear, and her face stared back at Sarah, eyes wide, frozen in time. "This was his game," Sarah murmured. "He was playing with them, playing with us." The team quickly gathered the evidence, taking photographs of the box and its contents before moving on to search the rest of the house. As they moved through the darkened rooms, they found more disturbing evidence of Fletcher's obsession. Maps, charts, and books detailing obscure occult rituals and symbols. It was clear now that this had been his twisted idea of a final solution. But as Sarah stood there, examining the collection of photographs, she knew that they had uncovered the heart of the case. Fletcher had been orchestrating everything, each disappearance, each symbol, each ritual. He had been waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to complete his vision. In the end, it was his obsession that led to his downfall. As the police moved in to arrest him, it became clear that his mind had long since unraveled. His actions, his meticulously planned game, had been his way of creating a sense of control in a world where he had none. He was no longer a man with a goal. He was a man driven by something far darker. The case was closed, but for Sarah, the questions still lingered. What drove James Fletcher to commit such atrocities? How had he convinced himself that he was justified in his actions? And most haunting of all, what would happen to the women who had been saved from his grasp? Their lives would never be the same, and neither would the city of Kelowna. As Sarah drove back to the precinct, the weight of the case still on her shoulders, she couldn't help but reflect on the fragile line between sanity and madness. She had seen many cases throughout her career, but this one, this case of the Kelowna disappearances, would stay with her forever. It wasn't just about the crime. It was about what it revealed, the darkness that could hide in plain sight, the obsessions that twisted a person's mind, and the way a single moment could change everything. The story of James Fletcher had come to an end. But for Sarah Bennett, it would always be a reminder of just how deep the shadows could go. Case 4. In the bustling streets of Tokyo, where the neon lights flickered as if in rhythm with the heartbeat of the city, the crime that would later become a haunting memory was brewing in the shadows. It was the year 2011 when a seemingly average individual, someone who had blended into the urban expanse of the city, committed an act that would capture the attention of the nation. His name was Yuji Takahashi, a man in his late 30s, who lived in a modest apartment near the city's outskirts. His quiet demeanor and lack of any noticeable background in criminal activity made him, at first glance, an unlikely suspect. He was known by his colleagues as a hard-working office worker who kept to himself. However, beneath this calm exterior lay a darker side that only a few would come to know too well. Yuji had been living in Tokyo for years, having moved there from a small rural town where everyone knew each other's name. Life in the city had been a stark contrast to his humble beginnings. He often struggled with feelings of loneliness and alienation, something that often drove him deeper into the recesses of his own mind. His job as a mid-level accountant was monotonous. The long hours spent at his desk in a corporate building left him exhausted and emotionally drained. Over the years, he had grown increasingly disillusioned with his life, finding little solace in his work or in the fleeting interactions he had with others. What most people didn't know about Yuji, however, was his obsession with the idea of escape. He was constantly searching for something that would break him free from the shackles of his mundane existence, something that would give him a sense of power, of control, something that could make him feel alive in a way that his daily routine never could. His thoughts began to spiral, and soon, his sense of reality began to blur. In the weeks leading up to the crime, Yuji had become fixated on the idea of disappearing. He wanted to vanish, not just from his job or his city, but from his entire life. The pressure of societal expectations weighed heavily on him. The constant reminder of his unfulfilled potential, the whispering thoughts of inadequacy, They all culminated in a decision that would change the course of his life forever. Yuji had been following the news of a recent string of high-profile disappearances across the country. It wasn't the first time such cases had appeared in the media, but something about them intrigued him, captured his imagination in a way that nothing else had. The idea that someone could simply vanish, leaving behind nothing but questions, was both thrilling and terrifying to him. It was an escape he had never considered before, an opportunity to take control of his destiny. One late evening in early autumn, after a long day at work, Yuji returned to his apartment. The evening was cool, with the last vestiges of daylight slowly fading into the night. He had grown accustomed to the emptiness that greeted him when he walked through his door. The apartment was small, but it was his only sanctuary in a world that often seemed indifferent to his existence. Yet, on that particular evening, there was a change in the air. A strange, quiet resolve had settled over him, one that had been slowly building over the past few months. Yuji had planned every detail of what he was about to do. He had spent weeks researching methods of disappearance, how to make himself invisible, how to erase every trace of his life from the eyes of others. His goal wasn't just to escape the constraints of his life, but to erase himself entirely. He wanted to be forgotten, to fade away in a way that would leave no trace, no memory behind. In his mind, it wasn't just an act of liberation. It was a final statement, an assertion of control over his own fate. His plan involved leaving his apartment, his job, his friends, and everything behind in a single calculated movement. Yuji had no intention of returning, at least, not in a way anyone would recognize him. The idea of disappearing without a trace was the only thing that seemed to offer him solace. That night, Yuji carefully packed a bag with only the essentials, clothes, a small amount of money, and a few other items he deemed necessary. He didn't need much. His goal was not to survive in the conventional sense. It was to vanish completely, to make a break from everything he had known. As he stood in front of the mirror one final time before leaving his apartment, Yuji stared at his reflection, barely recognizing the person looking back at him. The man in the mirror seemed distant, detached from the person he once was. His thoughts turned inward, and for a brief moment, he wondered what his life might have been like if he had chosen a different path. But that thought was fleeting, easily pushed aside by the overwhelming desire to escape. Yuji stepped out of his apartment, locking the door behind him. He didn't look back. The streets of Tokyo were as bustling as ever, the night alive with the sounds of cars honking, people chatting in cafes, and the distant hum of trains speeding by. But Yuji didn't notice any of it. His mind was focused on the path ahead, his path to disappearance. As the hours passed, Yuji made his way through the city, moving like a shadow among the crowds. He avoided contact with others, blending in as much as possible. He wasn't running away from something specific, he was running away from everything. The weight of his past, the expectations, and the loneliness had become too much to bear. He needed to feel like he was in control of his own story, even if that meant erasing it completely. He traveled through Tokyo, passing familiar places that he had once frequented, but now they felt foreign to him. The city he had called home for so many years was now just a backdrop to his final act. Every step he took felt like a step further away from the person he used to be. There was no turning back now. In the days that followed, Yuji's disappearance went unnoticed by most. His colleagues at work were confused when he didn't show up, but given his quiet nature, no one thought much of it at first. It wasn't until a few days later, when his absence was still unexplained, that the alarm bells began to ring. His family, too, was concerned but didn't know where to start looking. Yuji had been known for his solitary lifestyle, and his disappearance seemed to be just another example of his tendency to isolate himself. But as time passed, the realization set in. Yuji Takahashi had vanished. No trace, no evidence, no clue as to where he had gone. And so a search began, a search that would stretch across the country, spanning multiple cities and involving local police forces. But no matter how hard they looked, there was no sign of him. Yuji's disappearance would later be discussed in the media as a case of a man who had seemingly slipped through the cracks of society. The press speculated on the reasons behind his sudden disappearance. Was it a result of his mental state? Did he leave voluntarily, or had something sinister happened? In the end, the mystery of Yuji Takahashi's disappearance would remain unsolved, a lingering question in the minds of those who knew him. For Yuji, though, the story was far from over. His disappearance was not a result of being forgotten. It was his final attempt to reclaim his life, even if it meant erasing it entirely. As the investigation into his whereabouts continued, one thing became clear. Yuji Takahashi had successfully vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions and a life that would never truly be understood. The search for Yuji Takahashi began with more questions than answers. Initially, the police focused on his personal connections, his colleagues, his friends, his family, and even his distant acquaintances. His co-workers described him as a reserved man, someone who did his work diligently, but never seemed to connect with others on a deeper level. At first, it was easy to dismiss his absence as just another case of someone needing a break, taking time off, or going on an unannounced leave. But as the days stretched into a week, the concern began to mount. Yuji had always been reliable, albeit distant. His disappearance was out of character, and that left people to wonder. Where had he gone? The media, ever hungry for a story, latched onto the mystery. The public's curiosity was piqued. Yuji's face flashed on television screens across the nation. Missing person, Yuji Takahashi, the newscasters announced, the words rolling off their tongues with an air of mystery and intrigue. Social media buzzed with theories about what had happened to him. Some people believed he had run away to escape an unbearable life. Others speculated that something darker was at play, that there was more to his disappearance than met the eye. The fact that Yuji had vanished so completely, leaving no trace, only fueled the speculations. Meanwhile, the police were combing through his apartment, his workplace, and his digital footprint. They found nothing out of the ordinary, save for the quiet life he had led. His apartment was sparsely furnished, a place that lacked any sign of emotional attachment. The walls were bare, except for a few framed pictures, one of him as a child, another of a trip to the mountains from years ago. His desk was filled with neatly organized papers, no personal items, no hints at a hidden life. Even his computer, when examined, revealed only work-related emails and documents. Nothing to suggest a sudden, spontaneous decision to disappear. The only clue they found was an odd journal entry written in Yuji's handwriting. It was brief but gave them a glimpse into his state of mind in the days leading up to his disappearance. The entry was cryptic, almost poetic, as if Yuji had been wrestling with something intangible. "I am not who I once was," it read. "The world is too much, and I am too small to matter in it. I will erase myself to see if the void will be kinder than the life I have known." It was chilling, a snapshot of the isolation and disillusionment that had consumed Yuji in the final days before he vanished. As the weeks passed, the case seemed to stall. Investigators searched the places Yuji might have gone, but each lead turned out to be a dead end. His bank accounts remained untouched. His phone went silent, and no one could trace his movements after he left his apartment. It was as though Yuji had simply fallen off the face of the earth. Despite the mounting frustration, a small group of investigators refused to give up. They decided to dig deeper into Yuji's past. They combed through public records, searching for anything that might shed light on his motivations. They discovered that Yuji had grown up in a small town in Hokkaido, far removed from the frenetic pace of Tokyo. He had moved to the capital with high hopes, eager to make a name for himself in the big city. But the reality of urban life had been harsher than he had anticipated. The loneliness that followed him there was something he had never fully understood. Despite his success as an accountant, Yuji never felt like he truly belonged. Over the years, he had become more and more withdrawn, choosing to isolate himself rather than try to connect with others. One of his old friends from Hokkaido, a woman named Haruka, was contacted by the police. Haruka remembered Yuji as a bright, ambitious young man, someone with dreams of achieving great things. But those dreams had slowly eroded over time. He was never the same after moving to Tokyo, Haruka recalled. He used to talk about how much he wanted to make it big, but then he started saying he felt like he was just a small part of a bigger machine. He said he felt invisible. Haruka's voice cracked as she spoke, the pain of seeing her old friend deteriorate too much to bear. There was a sense of helplessness in her words, as if she had watched Yuji's gradual decline from afar, unable to offer him the support he needed. It was clear that Yuji had been battling an internal struggle, one that no one had fully understood until it was too late. As the investigation continued, it became apparent that Yuji's disappearance was not just a simple case of someone running away. His meticulous planning, his desire to vanish without a trace, suggested a deeper level of despair, something far more complex than a fleeting desire for escape. There was a quiet rage in his actions, a final rejection of the life that had been imposed on him. Yuji's decision to disappear wasn't just an act of running away, it was an act of defiance. A statement to the world that he could not, and would not, be confined by the expectations placed upon him. Weeks turned into months, and Yuji's case slowly faded from the media spotlight. People moved on with their lives, and the mystery of his disappearance became just another story of someone who couldn't cope with the pressures of life. But for those who knew him, the unanswered questions lingered in the air like a dark cloud. His family, his friends, and his colleagues were left with the same painful thought. What had driven Yuji to take such drastic steps? And more importantly, where had he gone? The investigation, while officially closed, continued in the hearts and minds of those who had known him. His case had become a symbol of something larger, of the silent struggles that many face in a world that demands so much of them. Yuji Takahashi's disappearance was a stark reminder of the dangers of isolation, of how easy it is for a person to slip through the cracks when they feel unseen and unheard. His story became a cautionary tale, one that echoed the haunting reality that sometimes people are lost not because they want to be found, but because they no longer know how to exist in a world that feels indifferent to their pain. Years passed, and life in Tokyo carried on as it always had. The streets remained crowded with people rushing to and from their destinations, unaware of the story that had unfolded quietly behind the scenes. Yuji Takahashi's name became a footnote in the annals of missing persons cases, another lost soul in a city too vast to notice one person slipping away. But for those who remembered him, his disappearance remained a poignant reminder of the fragility of the human spirit, and the quiet desperation that can sometimes drive a person to vanish, leaving behind nothing but the haunting question of why. As the months passed, the city of Tokyo continued to hum with its usual rhythm. People went about their daily routines, immersed in the bustling pace of modern life, and life seemed to move on without a second thought for the story of Yuji Takahashi. The media no longer reported on his disappearance, the police reports had been archived, and the case was officially closed. For most of the population, it was as if he had never existed. However, for those who knew him, the handful of colleagues, friends, and family who had once been close to him, there was a lingering, quiet sense of loss that never fully dissipated. Haruka, the woman who had once been Yuji's close friend from his hometown in Hokkaido, had returned to her own life after her brief conversation with the police. Though she had tried to move on, Yuji's disappearance haunted her thoughts during the quiet moments of her day. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, that there was something she had missed, something that could explain the deep, suffocating despair that had driven him to disappear so completely. Haruka had always known Yuji as a quiet, thoughtful person. He had never been the type to wear his emotions on his sleeve, but she could always sense the weight he carried. Back when they were young, he had spoken often of his dreams. Dreams of success, dreams of making a difference in the world. But as the years passed, those dreams seemed to fade into the background, overshadowed by the crushing weight of the demands placed on him. He had changed, and the Yuji she had known had been replaced by someone who seemed more distant, more withdrawn, almost as if he had given up on himself. It was after speaking to the police that Haruka began to question the narrative that had been painted for her. The investigators had initially brushed off any suggestions that Yuji's disappearance was anything other than a simple case of him running away, perhaps overwhelmed by the pressures of life in Tokyo. But Haruka wasn't convinced. She had known him too well to believe that Yuji had just disappeared without reason, without warning. There had to be more to his story, something deeper that no one else had noticed. In an attempt to piece together more of Yuji's life, Haruka began visiting his old haunts, places he used to frequent before he had vanished. She went to the small cafe near his apartment, the one he had often visited to escape the bustle of his daily life. The cafe owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Ito, recognized Haruka immediately. She had always been a quiet observer of Yuji's life and had noticed the change in him over time. He used to come here nearly every morning, Mrs. Ito said, her voice tinged with sadness. But in the last few months, he started coming in later and later. And when he did come in, he didn't say much. Just a coffee and a quick glance at the newspaper. He stopped talking about his work, about his life. It was like he had shut himself off from the world. Haruka listened intently, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to come together in her mind. She had always suspected that Yuji had been struggling with something, but hearing Mrs. Ito's account confirmed her fears. Something had changed within him. His outward demeanor had shifted, but he had never shared with anyone what was really happening inside his mind. His silence had become a barrier, one that kept people at arm's length. Mrs. Ito continued, her voice softening with concern. He started to seem like he was just going through the motions, you know. like a person trapped in a life they didn't choose but couldn't escape. And then one day, he didn't come in at all. I haven't seen him since. Haruka felt a pang of guilt. Had she missed the signs too? Had she been too caught up in her own life to notice how deeply Yuji had been struggling? She thought back to their conversations, the ones they had shared before he had left for Tokyo. He had been so full of ambition, so eager to make something of himself. He had talked about the future with such hope. But somewhere along the way, that hope had been extinguished, replaced by something darker, something unspoken. It was then that Haruka made a decision. She couldn't let Yuji's disappearance remain just another unsolved mystery. She would keep searching, even if it meant uncovering things that no one else was willing to see. She would find the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Her investigation led her to a place she hadn't expected, a quiet, out-of-the-way bookstore tucked between two larger buildings. The bookstore was small and unassuming, its shelves lined with books of every genre imaginable. Haruka had never noticed it before, but something about it caught her attention. There was an old, weathered sign in the window that read, "Books for the Lost." It seemed oddly fitting, like a place for people who had wandered off course in their lives. Inside the bookstore, the musty smell of old paper filled the air. Haruka walked slowly through the aisles, her fingers brushing against the spines of the books as she passed. The store was almost empty, save for a few customers browsing quietly. At the back of the store, an elderly man stood behind the counter, his glasses perched on the end of his nose as he carefully examined a book. When Haruka approached the counter, the man looked up and gave her a small, knowing smile. "Can I help you with something, miss?" "I'm looking for something," Haruka said softly, her voice hesitant. "A book that might help me understand someone. A friend who's missing." The man's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "I think I have just the thing," he said. He turned and walked down one of the aisles, pulling a dusty book from the shelf. It was an old, leather-bound volume, its cover cracked with age. "This is a rare book," the man explained as he handed it to Haruka. "It's about the human condition, about the way we cope with the pressures of life, about the inner struggles that no one ever sees. It's not for everyone, but I think it might be what you're looking for." Haruka took the book, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped it open. The pages were filled with deep philosophical musings, psychological insights, and stories of people who had disappeared from society. People who had vanished without a trace, much like Yuji. As she read, Haruka began to understand something she had never fully grasped before. The book spoke about the overwhelming weight of isolation, about how a person could lose themselves in the suffocating pressure of a world that demands so much. It talked about the moments when someone reaches their breaking point, when they no longer feel like they belong, and the only way to find peace is to disappear. Haruka's heart sank as she read. The book wasn't just a collection of stories. It was a reflection of Yuji's own internal battle. It was as if this book had been written for him, for the quiet man who had never asked for help, who had never shown anyone the depth of his pain. Haruka closed the book with a heavy sigh, her mind reeling with the realization that Yuji had been fighting battles that no one had ever seen. Her search was far from over, but this was the first piece of the puzzle she had found, an understanding of the inner turmoil that had led Yuji to disappear. And as Haruka left the bookstore, a newfound resolve filled her. She would continue to search for Yuji, not just as a missing person, but as someone who had been lost in a world too large to comprehend. As Haruka walked away from the bookstore, the streets of Tokyo felt a little more alive than they had just moments before. Her mind raced with the implications of what she had learned. The book had opened a new door, one she hadn't expected. Yuji's disappearance seemed to make more sense now, not in the way she had initially feared, but in a way that was both tragic and deeply human. She had always known that he had been struggling, but this was the first time she truly understood the depth of that struggle. The crowded streets, the neon signs, the rush of people moving in every direction, it all seemed to blur as Haruka's thoughts continued to swirl. She had come to Tokyo to find answers, but in that small, dusty bookstore, she had found something far more significant. She had discovered a piece of Yuji's soul, a glimpse into his world of silence and sorrow. And with that understanding came the painful realization that she might never fully understand what had driven him to leave. As she made her way back to her apartment, Haruka couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the verge of uncovering something bigger. Yuji's life, though seemingly insignificant to the outside world, had been one of quiet significance to those who truly knew him. She had once heard him say that he felt like he was a cog in the machine of society, one small part of a vast system, that didn't care if he succeeded or failed. Maybe that was true for all of them. Perhaps for everyone who had ever struggled to find their place in a world that constantly demanded more. The journey of searching for Yuji was no longer about simply finding him. It was about understanding what had happened, not just to him, but to so many others who felt just as he did. People who had slipped through the cracks of society, unnoticed and unheard. In some ways, Haruka was beginning to understand that this search was not only for Yuji, but for all of them. The people who had fallen silent in the face of overwhelming pressure. The ones who had lost themselves in the chaos of the world around them. Haruka spent the next few weeks following a trail of small leads, each one leading her further into the complexities of Yuji's life. She contacted old acquaintances, some of whom were more than willing to talk, and others who seemed reluctant to bring up his name. Every conversation left her with more questions than answers, and yet, there was a sense of urgency growing within her. Yuji's absence wasn't just a mystery. It was a reflection of a deeper, more troubling issue that was affecting the lives of so many people in the city. One evening, while reviewing some old messages Yuji had sent to her, Haruka came across a strange email. It was an encrypted message, one she hadn't seen before. She clicked on the file and waited as it decrypted. When the message finally appeared, it was brief but cryptic. Yuji had written, "I'm sorry for everything. It's not what you think, but it's too late now. I'll find peace where no one can reach me. Please understand." Haruka stared at the screen, feeling a wave of sadness and confusion wash over her. The words were both a farewell and a confession. It was clear that Yuji had been wrestling with something far beyond the surface of his everyday life. The line, "It's not what you think," stood out to her the most. What had he meant? What had he been hiding? And why had he felt the need to run, to disappear completely? With the email in hand, Haruka reached out to the police once again, hoping that they might be able to trace the origins of the message. But the response she received was far from what she had hoped for. The officer on the other end of the line sounded tired, almost dismissive. "We've been over this already, Ms. Sato. There's nothing more we can do. His case was closed months ago. You need to let it go." The words stung, but Haruka didn't let them deter her. She had come too far to stop now. She wasn't about to give up on Yuji, not when she was so close to understanding what had happened. She spent the following days combing through Yuji's social media, his messages, and any small clues she could find. It was exhausting mentally and emotionally draining, but she couldn't stop. Each new piece of information brought her one step closer to the truth. Eventually, Haruka discovered something unexpected, an address. It wasn't Yuji's apartment, nor was it a place he had ever mentioned. It was an obscure location in the outskirts of Tokyo, a small, rundown building that seemed to have no connection to him. There was something about it that sent a shiver down her spine. She couldn't explain why, but the address felt important. Without wasting any more time, Haruka decided to visit the place. The area was far from the bright lights of downtown Tokyo. The streets were quieter here, the buildings older, and the atmosphere felt heavy, as if time had slowed down in this part of the city. She followed the directions on her phone, each step bringing her closer to the mystery she had been chasing for weeks. The building was small and unremarkable, tucked between two larger structures that had long since been abandoned. Haruka approached it cautiously, her heart racing with anticipation. As she walked closer, she noticed something odd, a small, faded sign hanging near the entrance. The sign read, "Hope Counseling Center." Haruka's heart skipped a beat. She had never heard of this place before, but something about it seemed to fit with what she had learned about Yuji's struggles. The door creaked open as Haruka stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with old furniture scattered throughout. It smelled faintly of incense and something else, something she couldn't quite place. At the far end of the room was a desk, and behind it sat a woman, her back turned. Haruka hesitated, unsure of what to say or how to explain her presence. But before she could speak, the woman turned around. Her face was familiar. Haruka gasped as she recognized her. It was one of Yuji's old colleagues, someone who had worked with him for years before his disappearance. The woman's expression was unreadable, but her eyes held a certain sadness, as though she had been waiting for this moment. "You're here about Yuji, aren't you?" the woman asked quietly. Haruka nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm looking for him. I need to understand what happened." The woman sighed, her gaze shifting toward the floor. "I'm afraid I can't give you the answers you're looking for, but maybe I can help you understand him, if that's what you need." Haruka felt her heart pound in her chest as she faced the woman behind the desk. The recognition of her colleague, someone who had shared both the highs and lows of Yuji's career, seemed to shift the air around them. There was something in the woman's eyes that conveyed an understanding far deeper than words could express, a silent connection that made Haruka's breath catch in her throat. The woman leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped together on the desk. "You want to know what happened to Yuji, don't you?" Her voice was calm, measured, as though she had anticipated this question long before Haruka had even thought to ask. "Yes," Haruka replied softly, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "I don't understand why he left. Why he disappeared without a trace. It's not like him." The woman gave a faint nod, her expression softening. "It's not easy what you're asking. Yuji was a private person, someone who kept his emotions hidden. He didn't like to burden others with his struggles, even though they were heavy on his shoulders." Haruka felt a pang of guilt. She had always known Yuji as a man who carried a burden, but she had never fully understood the weight of it. She had never imagined that it would lead him to leave everything behind. "I don't know what I expected, but I thought I would have seen the signs. I should have known. You were his closest friend, Haruka," the woman said gently. "But some things are invisible to the people who love you the most. Sometimes the signs are there, but they're hidden beneath layers of quiet pain." Haruka's mind raced. "What do you mean by that? What happened to him?" The woman leaned back in her chair, her eyes looking far away, as though she were reliving the past. Yuji was struggling with more than just work, more than the pressures of everyday life. He was dealing with something much deeper, something that he never shared with anyone, not even me. He was constantly looking for meaning, a purpose. And when he couldn't find it, when the weight of everything became too much, he chose to disappear. Haruka felt her throat tighten. "So you're saying he left on purpose?" The woman nodded. "Yes. Yuji chose to walk away from everything. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was something he had been considering for a long time. He wanted to find peace, in a place where no one could reach him. He felt lost in the world, as though there was no place for him to belong." Haruka closed her eyes, taking in the weight of the words. She had always known that Yuji had been struggling, but hearing it so plainly, from someone who had seen him day after day, made it feel all the more real. It wasn't just the pressures of life that had pushed him to the edge. It was the internal battle, the quiet war that raged within him, that had ultimately led him to choose to disappear. "But why didn't he tell me?" Haruka asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't he come to me?" The woman sighed, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "Yuji didn't want to burden you, Haruka. He cared about you too much to make you carry his pain. And he thought that by leaving, he would somehow find the peace he was seeking. He thought it would be better for everyone if he just vanished." Haruka swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to escape. She had always believed that there was more to Yuji's disappearance than just a simple choice. But hearing it now, from someone who had known him better than she did, made the truth feel like a cold, heavy weight on her chest. "I didn't know," Haruka whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know it was this bad. I didn't know he was that alone." The woman's gaze softened as she stood up from her chair. She walked over to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder, handing it to Haruka. "These are some of Yuji's notes. He left them behind. I think he wanted you to have them, even if he never had the chance to give them to you directly." Haruka took the folder, her hands shaking as she opened it. Inside were a series of handwritten notes, some of them scribbled in a hurried, almost frantic hand, others neatly organized and more thoughtful in nature. The notes were a mixture of thoughts, reflections, and fragments of ideas. Some of them seemed disconnected, as though Yuji had been trying to make sense of something he couldn't quite grasp. Others were filled with passages that seemed to suggest he had been seeking a sense of purpose, a reason to continue. One particular note caught Haruka's attention. It was a simple sentence, written in large, bold letters. "The answer is not out there, it is within me." Haruka read it again, slowly, trying to make sense of the meaning behind it. The rest of the note was filled with more cryptic thoughts, but this sentence stood out. Was this what Yuji had been searching for? Had he been trying to find something within himself, something he couldn't put into words? Had he been looking for peace in a world that made no sense to him? As Haruka read on, she found other notes that spoke of his struggle with his own identity, his place in the world, and his overwhelming sense of disconnection. It was clear that Yuji had been going through something that no one had understood, not even Haruka. But these notes, these fragments of his soul, offered a glimpse into the turmoil he had been facing. "I never knew he felt this way," Haruka said softly, almost to herself. "I thought I knew him, but there was so much I didn't understand." The woman behind the desk nodded. None of us truly knew the full extent of what he was dealing with. He kept it hidden, even from those closest to him. But these notes, they show us a side of him that we never got to see. Haruka closed the folder, feeling the weight of the words pressing down on her chest. "I need to find him," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "I need to know where he went. I need to tell him that I understand now, that I never wanted him to feel this alone." The woman watched her, her expression unreadable. "I can't tell you where he is, Haruka. I wish I could, but I don't know." Yuji made his choice. And I think deep down he wanted it that way. He wanted to be at peace, even if it meant cutting ties with the people who cared about him. Haruka stood up, the folder still in her hands. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for telling me what you know." The woman nodded, offering a small, sad smile. "I hope you find the peace you're looking for, Haruka. And I hope you find Yuji, if that's what you need." Haruka turned and walked toward the door, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She had come to this place looking for answers, but what she had found was something far deeper. Something that spoke to the heart of her own fears and uncertainties. Yuji's struggle, his search for meaning, had been something he had fought alone. But now, Haruka understood that she wasn't alone either. She had the strength to face her own questions, to search for her own answers, just as Yuji had. As she stepped out into the cold night air, Haruka made a silent vow to herself. She would keep searching, not just for Yuji, but for the truth, whatever that truth might be. And she would carry the lessons she had learned from this journey with her, forever changed by the understanding of what it truly means to search for peace. Case 5. In the vibrant city of Sydney, Australia, there are moments when the shadows of crime creep through the bustling streets. While the city's beauty and charm captivate many, there exists a side seldom seen, where the consequences of unlawful acts echo through its corridors. The case I'm about to unfold takes us into the world of a criminal whose actions were far from ordinary. This is a story not often told in the public eye, a tale of deception, manipulation, and betrayal that left the city reeling. The name of the perpetrator is Daniel Russo. He was not the type who would catch attention in a crowd at first glance. In fact, his appearance was quite unremarkable, average height, average build, with short, unkempt brown hair and a casual demeanor. He could blend into the background effortlessly. But as his story would unfold, those who once thought little of him would realize how dangerous he truly was. Russo wasn't just another petty criminal. He was a mastermind in disguise, a man who knew how to manipulate the system to his advantage. Born and raised in the suburbs of Sydney, Daniel Russo's early life seemed fairly uneventful. He had a reputation as a quiet and reserved child, one who preferred the solitude of books over socializing with his peers. Schoolmates recalled him as an introvert, always keeping to himself, but showing flashes of intelligence and ambition. He didn't stand out in any way that would indicate his later descent into the darker aspects of society. His parents, immigrants who had settled in Australia decades ago, did their best to give him a stable upbringing. But life was always a bit of a struggle for the Russo family. Money was tight, and Russo often witnessed his parents struggle to make ends meet, which planted seeds of resentment and frustration deep within him. As he grew older, Russo became more and more determined to break free from the confines of his modest upbringing. He wanted more than what his family could offer, more than what his friends had, and more than what society expected of him. He became enamored with the idea of wealth and success, but the road to achieve it wasn't one he was willing to take in a traditional sense. Russo began associating with individuals who lived outside the law, observing how they could manipulate systems to their advantage. He learned quickly, and by the time he was in his late 20s, Russo had become involved in a series of illicit activities. At first, it started with small-scale cons. He would trick people into lending him money under false pretenses, promising them lucrative returns on investments that never materialized. But the more successful he became in these small-time schemes, the more ambitious he grew. Eventually, Russo realized that the true path to wealth lay not in individual scams, but in a larger, more systematic operation. He needed a plan that would generate consistent profits without raising suspicion, and he found it through the world of high-end fraud. It was in 2015 when Russo took his first significant step into the world of organized crime. He infiltrated the tech industry, using his knowledge of computers and data systems to manipulate financial records. By hacking into the accounts of wealthy individuals and companies, Russo was able to transfer large sums of money into his own hands without detection. He became adept at covering his tracks, using encrypted networks and fake identities to make sure his crimes went unnoticed. For a few years, Russo operated under the radar. He lived a life of luxury, buying expensive cars, clothing, and property. He kept a low profile, never drawing attention to himself. He spent his time frequenting high-end restaurants, mingling with Sydney's elite, all the while knowing that his success came at the expense of others' hard-earned money. His life, on the surface, seemed perfect, until the day everything came crashing down. In early 2019, Russo made a critical mistake. As he continued his operations, he began to grow more arrogant, convinced that he was untouchable. He grew careless with his digital footprints and became involved in a high-profile scam that targeted several influential figures in the business world. It was a sophisticated scheme involving the manipulation of stock market information, insider trading, and fraudulent financial reports. Russo thought he could control the entire situation, but it didn't take long for law enforcement agencies to take notice. The first indication that Russo's operation was at risk came when one of his accomplices was arrested during a routine financial investigation. The authorities were beginning to piece together a larger picture of what had been happening, and it wasn't long before they zeroed in on Russo. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Russo's network was far more extensive than anyone had initially anticipated. His ability to stay under the radar for so long had allowed him to build a web of criminal activity that spanned not just across Sydney, but the entire country. By the time the authorities had gathered enough evidence to make an arrest, Russo had already disappeared. He went into hiding, changing his appearance, cutting ties with old associates, and using false identities to evade capture. But as the months went by, the net closed in on him. In the end, it wasn't his criminal genius that led to his downfall, but his own vanity and carelessness. He had underestimated the power of the system he had worked so hard to manipulate. Russo was eventually tracked down in late 2020, living under an assumed name in a small town outside of Sydney. His arrest was swift, and the investigation into his criminal activities revealed the full extent of his operations. By the time he was apprehended, Russo had stolen millions of dollars, leaving a trail of victims in his wake. The financial institutions, business moguls, and everyday individuals he had targeted were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The case sent shockwaves through Sydney and beyond. How had someone like Daniel Russo, a man who seemed so ordinary, been able to operate such a sophisticated and far-reaching criminal empire for so long? The answer lay in his ability to manipulate and deceive, to blend into the background while pulling the strings behind the scenes. Russo was, in many ways, a symbol of the darker side of ambition, the lengths one could go to when driven by greed and the desire for wealth. As the trial approached, the city of Sydney watched closely, eager to see the consequences of Russo's actions. The story of his rise and fall became a cautionary tale, one that warned of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the inevitable consequences of living a life built on lies. In the end, Daniel Russo's story was a stark reminder that no matter how carefully a criminal may plan, there is always a reckoning waiting on the horizon. And for those who think they can outsmart the system forever, the truth is often just around the corner. Daniel Russo's fall was not an easy one. The man who had once believed himself to be invincible, the master of deception and manipulation, was now faced with the consequences of his actions. As he sat in the back of the police van, handcuffed and silent, a wave of realization washed over him. It was over. The life of luxury, the fast cars, the endless parties, all of it had come crashing down in a single moment. When Russo had first started his operation, he had imagined a life where he could continue his criminal enterprise without fear of detection. But that life had always been built on shaky ground, on the assumption that he could outsmart everyone, law enforcement, business executives, and even his own associates. But over time, his arrogance grew, and so did his disregard for the very things that had once kept him hidden in the shadows. He had been careful in the beginning. He understood the importance of discretion, of blending into the crowd and being just another face in the crowd. He used his knowledge of technology to stay ahead, to ensure that every transaction was hidden beneath layers of encryption. He had spent hours upon hours perfecting his craft, studying the intricacies of digital security, and learning how to cover his tracks so thoroughly that even the most skilled investigators would find it impossible to trace him. But with each success, Russo grew bolder, more confident in his abilities. He began taking greater risks, expanding his operations to involve more people, more money, and more complex schemes. It was no longer enough to simply defraud individuals here and there. He wanted to change the game entirely. He wanted to control entire financial markets, manipulate stock prices, and create a vast empire built on nothing but lies and deceit. He had been careful at first, but then came the greed. As he expanded his network of contacts and associates, he began to make bigger deals, securing partnerships with high-ranking businessmen and influential individuals. Russo had an uncanny ability to win people over with his charm, convincing them that his plans would lead to untold riches. He could speak their language, play on their desires, and make them believe that he was their ticket to unimaginable wealth. But behind closed doors, Russo was always playing a different game. He would provide false financial statements, manipulate stock prices, and create fake investments that promised huge returns but delivered nothing. He was a puppet master, pulling the strings of everyone around him while he remained in the shadows, unseen and unnoticed. His ability to play the game was unparalleled, and for years, it seemed as though nothing could stop him. However, as the days turned into months, and the months into years, cracks began to appear in his carefully constructed empire. The more money he made, the more he wanted. And the more he wanted, the more he pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The people he worked with began to get suspicious. They began asking questions, demanding answers, and soon Russo's network started to fray at the edges. It was during one of these moments, when Russo had made a critical misstep, that things began to unravel. One of his associates, a man named Marcus, had become increasingly uneasy with the way things were going. Marcus had been with Russo since the early days, helping him launder money and cover up the fraudulent transactions. But he had always been more cautious than Russo, less willing to take risks, and the more he saw of Russo's reckless behavior, the more he began to question their operations. One day, Marcus discovered something that would change everything. He found a trail of discrepancies in the financial records, small at first, but enough to raise alarm bells. It wasn't just the missing money. It was the growing suspicion that someone was getting sloppy. Marcus knew that if the wrong person found out, everything could come crashing down. But instead of confronting Russo, he made a fateful decision. He went to the authorities. The investigation into Russo's activities began quietly at first. The authorities had no concrete evidence, but the whispers began to spread. The banks, the corporations, the businesses that had been affected by Russo's scheme started to notice the irregularities. It was only a matter of time before the truth began to surface. As the investigation grew, so did the pressure on Russo. He began to feel the heat closing in on him, but he was determined to escape. He had always been able to outsmart those around him, and he believed that, with a little time, he could disappear and start over somewhere else. But as the walls began to close in, he realized that he couldn't run forever. The truth was catching up with him, and there was nowhere left to hide. Russo's downfall came in the most unexpected of ways. The very thing that had kept him safe for so long, the digital world, was also the thing that ultimately betrayed him. As he scrambled to erase his traces, to delete every file and destroy every record, he made one critical error. A single file, slipped through the cracks. It was this file that would become the key to unraveling his entire operation. The authorities managed to recover it during a routine sweep of his computers, and inside, they found everything they needed. The financial records, the names of his accomplices, the details of the fraudulent transactions. It was all there, neatly documented and organized. In that moment, Daniel Russo knew it was over. He had been caught. The trial that followed was one of the most highly publicized in Sydney's history. News outlets from all over the country covered the case, eager to share the story of the man who had manipulated the system for so long. The courtroom was filled with reporters, lawyers, and spectators, all eager to witness the fall of the man who had once believed himself untouchable. Russo sat in the dock, his once confident demeanor replaced by a look of resignation. His lawyer, a well-known defense attorney, argued that Russo had been coerced into his actions, that he had been forced to participate in the scheme by powerful individuals beyond his control. But no one was buying it. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the public was not sympathetic to his plight. As the trial progressed, the full extent of Russo's crimes became clear. He had stolen millions of dollars from unsuspecting victims, leaving them financially ruined and emotionally shattered. Business executives, middle-class families, and even elderly retirees had fallen victim to his schemes. Many of them had lost their life savings, their dreams of a better future shattered by the actions of one man. In the end, Russo was convicted on multiple charges of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, but even as the sentence was handed down, Russo seemed unfazed. He had lived a life of privilege and excess for so long that the reality of his situation didn't seem to hit him until later. He was no longer the master of his own fate. He was just another prisoner, waiting for the day when his name would be forgotten. The impact of Russo's crimes was far-reaching. His actions had shaken the foundations of the financial world, and many of his victims struggled to rebuild their lives. Some had lost everything, while others had been forced to start over from scratch. It was a harsh reminder of how easily the systems that people rely on can be manipulated by those with the right knowledge and the right tools. As for Russo, he spent his days in prison, reflecting on the life he had lived and the choices he had made. He had once believed that he was in control, that he could bend the world to his will. But in the end, it was the world that had controlled him. His greed, his arrogance, and his disregard for the well-being of others had led him down a path from which there was no return. The case of Daniel Russo serves as a chilling reminder of the lengths to which some people will go in pursuit of wealth and power. It shows the dangers of unchecked ambition, of a mindset that believes rules don't apply to them. In the end, it was not his criminal genius that led to his downfall, but his own sense of invincibility and his inability to recognize that even the most carefully laid plans can crumble when the truth is exposed. Daniel Russo's life in prison was a far cry from the luxurious existence he had once enjoyed. Gone were the days of high-end suits, fine dining, and private jets. Instead, he found himself in a stark, concrete cell with little more than a cot and a toilet. The silence of his new world was deafening. The constant hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the occasional clang of metal doors opening and closing, and the muffled voices of other inmates filled the air. It was a far cry from the fast-paced, high-stakes world he had once thrived in. At first, Daniel had struggled with the reality of his situation. He had spent so many years living in a bubble of comfort and power, insulated from the consequences of his actions. Now those actions had caught up with him, and there was no escaping the consequences. In the beginning, he had raged against the injustice of it all. He blamed the system, the people who had betrayed him, the investigators who had exposed his empire. But as the weeks turned into months and the months into years, his anger began to subside, replaced by a quiet resignation. The walls of his cell felt like they were closing in on him. He spent his days pacing, lost in thought, trying to come to terms with the life he had destroyed. The once confident and charismatic man who had manipulated people with ease now found himself at the mercy of a system that was indifferent to his past achievements. His wealth and influence had once shielded him from the consequences of his actions, but now they were meaningless. As Daniel reflected on his life, he began to see the cracks in the facade he had built. He had always told himself that he was playing the long game, that his schemes were necessary for survival in a world that was inherently unfair. But as he thought about the lives he had ruined, the families he had destroyed, the businesses he had wrecked, he realized the truth. He had been nothing more than a selfish man driven by greed, blinded by his own ambition. The empire he had built had been constructed on the backs of innocent people, and now those people were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. One of the things that haunted Daniel the most was the impact his actions had on his family. He had always been careful to keep his personal life separate from his criminal activities, but now, in the quiet of his prison cell, he couldn't escape the thought of his wife, Anna, and their 2 children. He had built a life for them, provided for them, and yet he had destroyed that life with his own hands. Anna had stood by him for years, supporting him through thick and thin, and now she was left to deal with the fallout from his actions. Daniel remembered the day he had been arrested, the look of disbelief on Anna's face as the police took him away. She had always known there were things he wasn't telling her, but she had never imagined that her husband could be involved in something so devastating. The pain in her eyes still lingered in Daniel's mind. He had hurt her, and he couldn't undo that. He had destroyed the family he had worked so hard to build. In prison, Daniel was left to grapple with the consequences of his choices. He had no one to blame but himself. His wealth, his power, his connections, they had all been meaningless in the face of the law. As the days turned into weeks, he began to understand the true nature of his downfall. It wasn't the police, the investigators, or even his associates who had betrayed him. It was his own arrogance, his own sense of invincibility, that had led him to believe he could outsmart the system forever. During the early years of his sentence, Daniel tried to maintain a sense of dignity. He kept his head down, followed the rules, and did what he could to stay out of trouble. But it wasn't long before he realized that prison wasn't the place for someone like him. He had been used to controlling every aspect of his life, but in prison, he was just another inmate. The power he had once held was gone, replaced by the harsh realities of life behind bars. There were moments when Daniel thought about reaching out to his old associates, the ones who had once been a part of his criminal empire. He wondered if they were still active, still operating in the shadows, still profiting from the schemes he had set in motion. But those thoughts were fleeting. The people he had once trusted were long gone, and he had burned every bridge that might have led to a way out. No one cared about him now. The days blurred together as Daniel settled into a routine. He spent most of his time reading, trying to fill the void left by the lack of stimulation and excitement. He had always been a voracious reader, using books as a way to escape the pressures of his own mind. But now, in prison, those books became a way for him to confront the reality of his life. He read about crime, about the justice system, about redemption, and in doing so, he began to understand the magnitude of what he had done. Daniel had always believed that people like him were above the law, that they could manipulate the system to their advantage. But prison had taught him otherwise. The law was not something that could be ignored or bent to one's will. It was an unyielding force, and no matter how clever or powerful someone might be, they could not escape its reach forever. Daniel had spent years thinking he was invincible, but now he understood that no one was above the law. As the years passed, Daniel began to change. He started to reflect on the choices he had made, the people he had hurt, and the damage he had caused. He had been consumed by greed, blinded by ambition, and now he was paying the price for it. The person he had been was gone, replaced by someone who had learned the hard way that there were consequences for every action. But as Daniel looked back on his life, he also realized that he couldn't change the past. The people he had wronged would never be able to undo the damage he had caused, and his family would never be able to return to the life they had once known. But there was one thing he could do. He could start to make amends. It wasn't much, but it was something. And so, he began the slow, painful process of trying to make things right. Daniel's path to redemption would not be easy. The damage he had caused was far-reaching, and it would take more than just a few good deeds to undo the harm he had done. But he was determined to try. He knew that he could never fully repay the people he had hurt, but he could start by taking responsibility for his actions and working to make a positive impact, no matter how small. Over time, Daniel began to earn the respect of some of the other inmates. He wasn't a hardened criminal like many of them, but his experiences in the outside world had given him a unique perspective on life. He began to use his knowledge of business and finance to help others. He started a program where he taught fellow inmates about financial literacy, about managing money, about making better choices in life. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. Daniel knew that he would never be able to fully atone for the sins of his past, but he also knew that redemption wasn't about erasing one's mistakes. It was about owning them, learning from them, and doing what was possible to make the world a better place, one small act at a time. In the end, Daniel Russo's story was one of loss, of regret, and of a man who had come to understand the true cost of his actions. His empire, once vast and unshakable, had crumbled. His wealth, once the envy of the world, had become meaningless. And yet, in the quiet solitude of his prison cell, Daniel found something that had eluded him for much of his life: peace. It wasn't the peace of wealth or power, but the peace that comes from accepting responsibility and doing what one can to make things right. And for the first time in years, Daniel Russo felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could begin to rebuild the life he had destroyed. As Daniel Russo continued to navigate life behind bars, the monotony of each day began to carve a different rhythm into his soul. Gone were the distractions of the outside world, the meetings, the deals, the phone calls, and in their place, a quiet stillness began to settle. It wasn't peace, exactly, but a sense of resignation. The constant noise, the ambition-driven chaos of his former life, seemed to fade into nothingness as the years wore on. He could no longer escape the truth, that his empire, built on manipulation and lies, had crumbled under the weight of its own deceit. In the beginning, Daniel had been too proud, too sure of his ability to bend the world to his will, to admit to himself that it was all over. But as time passed, something shifted within him. Perhaps it was the realization that there would be no grand redemption, no miraculous return to the life he had once known. The world didn't owe him anything. His wealth and status were no longer at his disposal, and the people who had once feared him had long since moved on. But through all the frustration, anger, and regret, Daniel had begun to see glimpses of something different, a spark that hadn't been entirely extinguished. He had always been a survivor, someone who had built his success through sheer willpower and a ruthless determination to get ahead. And though the rules of this new world, the world behind bars, were different, he found himself slowly adapting. There was a strange satisfaction in knowing that, despite everything, he was still capable of enduring. Life inside the prison walls was grim, to say the least. It was a place where the strong ruled and the weak were preyed upon. Yet Daniel, once a feared businessman, had come to understand that physical strength wasn't what mattered most here. Power, inside these walls, was something more subtle. It was about influence, negotiation, and survival. Daniel's mind, sharp as ever, quickly adapted to the new game. He began observing the inmates, taking note of the alliances, the power structures, the way people moved and spoke. He had spent so much of his life in the world of high-stakes business deals, and the mechanics of that world were similar in many ways to the rules of the prison system. He learned quickly that the key to survival was not just keeping your head down, but understanding the undercurrents of power that flowed through the prison. Every inmate had a story, a reason they had ended up here, and Daniel realized that everyone had something they were trying to protect, something they feared losing. Some were here for violent crimes, others for white-collar offenses like his own, but in the end, they all had the same basic need: security. The ability to feel like they had some control over their lives, even in the most oppressive circumstances. Daniel wasn't foolish enough to believe that he could reclaim his old life, but he began to see an opportunity to build something new within the confines of the prison walls. As he spent more time observing and interacting with other inmates, he started offering his expertise. At first, it was small things: advice on managing personal finances, how to save money within the confines of the prison system, and ways to stay out of debt with the corrupt system that existed within the prison economy. The small acts of kindness didn't go unnoticed. The inmates who had initially seen him as just another rich, arrogant businessman began to respect him for his intelligence and pragmatic approach to life inside. A shift began to take place within Daniel. The old him, the man who had manipulated, lied, and schemed, was fading away. The lessons of prison were harsh and unrelenting, but they were also awakening a side of him that had been dormant for years. There was something deeply humbling about seeing the lives of others who, despite their own mistakes and flaws, had found a way to survive in this world. Some of them had committed heinous crimes, while others were simply victims of circumstance, swept up in situations beyond their control. Regardless of the crimes they had committed, they all had one thing in common: they were all trying to survive. As the months turned into years, Daniel began to build a reputation as someone who could be trusted, someone who could be relied upon for advice. His financial literacy programs grew in popularity, and he began mentoring other inmates who showed an interest in improving their lives. He found himself spending hours in the prison library, reading books on a wide range of topics: psychology, philosophy, literature, and even the occasional business journal. He had always been driven by the need to succeed, but now the desire to learn felt more like a need to understand, to make sense of the mess he had created, and perhaps to find a way to make amends for it. Still, Daniel couldn't escape the weight of his past. The truth hung over him like a cloud, no matter how many books he read or how many programs he started. He had built his life on lies, on manipulation, and on exploiting the weaknesses of others. No amount of teaching or mentoring could undo that. The guilt was a constant companion, a shadow that followed him everywhere. And yet, in those quiet moments when he was alone in his cell, he couldn't help but wonder: was it possible to find redemption? Was it possible to make up for the destruction he had caused? His thoughts often turned to his family, especially Anna. The pain of knowing that he had hurt her, that he had destroyed the life they had built together, was a wound that never healed. The thought of his children, growing up without him, added to the weight of his regret. He had missed birthdays, holidays, and countless moments that could never be recaptured. He knew that Anna had tried to move on, that she had tried to rebuild her life without him, but he also knew that it was a struggle. Their marriage had been built on a lie, and now they were both living in the aftermath of that lie. Daniel had often wondered if Anna could ever forgive him for the choices he had made, for the man he had become. In the quiet of his cell, he realized that forgiveness wasn't something that could be demanded. It was something that had to be earned, one small action at a time. But as Daniel continued to work within the prison system, helping others and slowly rebuilding his sense of self, he realized that there was no easy answer to his questions. Redemption was a long and difficult road, and he wasn't sure if he would ever truly reach the end. He knew that there were no guarantees, that his past would always be a part of him, no matter how much he tried to change. Yet, as the years continued to pass, Daniel found himself starting to believe in the possibility of change. Maybe he couldn't undo the past, but perhaps he could influence the future. His work in the prison, his efforts to educate and mentor, began to take on new meaning. He wasn't just passing the time anymore. He was building something real, something that could last beyond the walls of his prison cell. It wasn't about redemption in the traditional sense. It wasn't about proving he was a good man again. It was about taking responsibility for the person he had been, and doing what he could to make the world a little better, one small step at a time. As the prison years stretched on, Daniel Russo found a strange sense of peace in his new life. It wasn't the peace he had once sought in wealth, power, and control. It wasn't the peace of a man who had it all. Instead, it was the peace of a man who had lost everything, but who had finally begun to understand what really mattered.